I have spent an absurd amount of time testing all 138 unique relic effects in Nightreign across almost 200 runs and hours of rigorous testing in the training grounds with every single Nightfarer to give you the most objective analysis and tier list you'll ever watch for this game. There were dozens of fascinating discoveries I was able to uncover about exactly how some of these relics with incredibly vague descriptions actually function, with some effects being absolutely absurd in how powerful they are when used properly. There have been a lot of people spreading misinformation and those who are just flat out wrong in their explanation of certain relic effects and mechanics in the game from what I've been seeing over the last month, so I hope to make the inner workings of this game much more clear to you here today. By the end of this video, there will be no doubt in your mind as to what the best and worst relics in the game are to run for any particular Nightfarer, along with which of the more specific and complete named relics like the ones you get from Remembrances are worth using. So make sure to stick around from beginning to end so that you don't miss any key breakdowns. You're going to learn a lot here today, I promise. It's worth mentioning that of course any tier list is going to be subjective in nature, so if you disagree with any of my rankings, I'm happy to hear your case for why you'd rank it differently, and I'm always open to having my mind changed, which it often is after reading your comments in my other tier list videos. So definitely share your thoughts if you have any. In terms of ranking criteria, I think there are a few things to consider into each ranking that should be applied to all effects to try to get us as close to being objective as possible. Broadly speaking, we're looking for anything that increases the likelihood of success of a run, but that can be broken down into more specific buckets, including but not limited to, does this increase my overall damage output across the run by means of pure damage amp, making something deal more AoE damage, or my ults being up more often? Does my survivability increase by means of damage negation or greater base stats? Does this effect impact my entire team or just me, and therefore should I multiply its inherent value by 2 or 3? Or does this provide some other sort of utility that helps myself or my team more effectively kill bosses, survive, or navigate the map faster? Over what percentage of the run is this effect actually useful, and do I get some disproportionate benefits at the start or end of the run that makes it incredibly valuable to use, even if it's not useful at the other side of the run? And finally, how generally applicable is the effect I'm choosing to run? So for example, does the effect hinge on some sort of RNG to activate it, or does it have numerous conditions for it to work, or does it only work with specific weapons or damage types, forcing you to use a particular build to actually be useful? There are definitely more ways to break this down, but these are most of the things that I'm actively thinking about when trying to determine the ranking of an effect. Of course, it will be rare for any effect to tick all of these boxes, but as long as we think of these criteria as contributors to the more simple definition of does this make my run more likely to succeed consistently, then I think it's easier to compare everything against one another. The last thing I'll mention here is that obviously a lot of relic effects are going to be completely useless on certain Nightfarers, so I'll do my best to specify who will actually benefit from certain effects, where it will be variable as to how well they'll perform on different Nightfarers. Alright, I know this was a lot to preface before we actually dive into things, but I think it's important to have a strong set of ranking criteria for any tier list before you dive in, which we are now finally going to get into, so buckle up and enjoy this very long ride. I'm going to get us started with all of the unique relics from Remembrances, bosses, or secret tasks in the game first, since these are likely relics a lot of you are interested in knowing about, especially since many of these effects have horrid descriptions for what they actually do. I'll rank the individual effects first, then give the relic as a whole a ranking, and after that we'll go more methodically through the entire list of relic effects we didn't happen to cover from those first special relics. At the time of making this, not all of the Everdark Sovereigns have been released, and it's likely there are new effects that will be released down the road. If that's the case, I'll try to place some rankings in text format in the comments, or I'll create some sort of accessory video to cover those at a later date. First up are Wylder's unique Remembrance relics, starting with the Slate Whetstone. This first effect is a pretty cool one that modifies Wylder's Claw Shot follow-up attack to do a spinning flaming strike that gives you a plus 12 fire grease on greatswords for 20 seconds, while also doing a solid amount of damage with the attack itself. It definitely makes landing claw shot follow-ups way easier, and the area spin makes hitting smaller, quick enemies more consistent, which I enjoy a lot. However, the fact that it greases your weapon means that it'll override effects like Sacred Blade, or Lightning Slash, or even Flaming Strike, which all grease your weapons with a plus 21 boost, so this is a big net loss to damage after the follow-up, which is a bummer. If that isn't something you're planning on running or just don't have an effect for, then this is a bonus you'd be happy to have in addition to the great follow-up attack enhancement. I think it's very solid to run on Wylder and makes this kit feel more complete, so I'd say it's a solid A tier effect that's even better on runs where the Night Lord is weak to fire. The second effect is at its core a simple boost to physical damage, but it opens up this can of worms around damage enhancing effects that I think is important to explain right now, so let's broadly talk about attack power up type effects. I'm going to bundle this set of effects up into a general ranking, which includes all elemental attack power effects, so fire, holy, magic, and lightning. Then I'll talk about physical at the end. These come in three forms, that being the base version for 4.5% more damage, +1 is 5.5, and +2 is 6.5%. These effects can stack, so if you wanted to go all out on fire damage against the Sentient Pest or Fisher Night Lords, you could absolutely do this and guarantee that your damage against them is cranked up a few notches. Even with the base version giving 4.5% is fairly reasonable, and you could use it right away if you're pairing this with a starting armament of the same type of damage for a faster start to the run. However, because this is locked to a specific element type, it's a bit less versatile if you wanted to run a different weapon during Night 1 and Night 2 before using a weapon that matches this bonus and that the Night Lord is weak to on Night 3, when you compare this to relic effects that simply boost all physical damage, which does in fact apply to elemental damage, assuming it's dealt with a melee weapon or bow. Typically though, if you're intentionally slotting this, you're probably going to be running a matched weapon type, so that drawback isn't as relevant in most cases. I'd say this is a solid A- effect, as the damage is solid, can be useful at all stages of the run, and is stackable, which is a nice plus, and it works for spells as well, which is an advantage it has over damage boosters that only work on certain weapons, making this viable on Recluse or Revenant and Duchess if you're using them as spellcasters as well. As for the effect on the Whetstone, I'll make this one quick as it's functionally the same, only it broadly applies to physical damage, making it more versatile for runs where you're running multiple weapons of different types. The bonus here instead only gives 3, 4, 5% damages for the base, +1 and +2 respectively, so it's a tiny bit weaker as a trade-off for being more versatile. I think it's fair to rank it the same at an A-, as I think the trade-off is very balanced and it's a solid chunk of bonus damage with no strings attached. With that said, because the Whetstone is only a medium relic, despite having two very favorable effects for Wylder players, I'd still only call it a B-tier option since you're missing a whole effect. This is going to be better to run against bosses weak to fire, and you definitely won't want to run it if you're planning to use greases or skills that grease your weapon, since that modded heavy attack is going to be overriding it every single time you use it. Next up is Wylder's Earring, which bears two effects, with the first making his ult create a large fire AoE on the ground for 9 seconds after using his ult that does some pretty solid damage against anything unfortunate enough to be caught in its wake, ranging from 240 damage at level 1 to 530 at 15, and this makes his ult all around 70% stronger, assuming all damage gets dealt from the fire. It also does some minor stagger damage like Magma Shot would, and makes his ult significantly more potent because of this. While you aren't going to be ulting enough to make a massive contribution to your total damage during a run, Wylder definitely has one of the fastest charging ults, so you'll probably get some legitimate damage off from this effect if you're ulting every time you have it up. This also makes reviving teammates who've fallen into 3-bar territory much easier to revive, as the fire will help pick them up as well and prevents the bar from recharging in case you couldn't get those last hits off in time before a boss starts pummeling you again. It's not a game-changing effect, but it's fun and has real contribution to your damage, but other effects definitely outclass it by a significant margin, so I'll only give this a B+. The second effect on the earring is a very straightforward effect, but is it ever powerful? You just get one more skill charge for Wylder's Grapple, but this makes the game just so much more fun to play Wylder with, and it's hard to not run it once you've experienced it. Having an extra charge in reserve not only makes boss fights safer, knowing that you should realistically always have a backup grapple to get out of a sticky situation if you've just used one of your charges, but your general map mobility goes into hyperdrive. Nobody comes close to traversing the map faster than a 2-skill charge Wylder. It feels so nice zooming around the map with this. His skill also does a very respectable amount of damage, plus it can stagger any non-colossal enemies, making it effective CC for your team to get free hits in. A double grapple on a downed ally also does a ton of contribution to the revive bars in less than a second, so the versatility and usefulness of this effect is plentiful. I truly think this is a must run on Wylder above all of his other unique relic effects, even trading off some pure damage or general survivability effects just to keep this running, as it helps your gameplay all around. This is an S+ for me for sure. The final effect on the earring is stamina recovers with each successful attack, and it's a lot more powerful than you may think, giving you 2 stamina per attack with the baseline version that this relic bears, and 3 for the +1 version that some others have. But they can't be stacked. For anyone other than Duchess if you're using daggers, and Revenant if you're using claws, and maybe Executor to a small degree, this won't break the game, but it'll still have noticeable effects. I tested this with every character and their ideal weapon types, and for Duchess and Revenant, you're able to crank out 75% more light attack hits than normal with the +1 version of this relic, which is kind of insane. While all the other melee characters other than Raider got a 25% boost, whereas he still got a modest 17% boost. This doesn't factor in using things like heavy or charged attacks, and the final swing of a combo that uses more stamina, which would obviously bring these numbers down quite a lot, but on the quick hitters, at least the difference is still very substantial. This gives you so much more room to get a full combo off while still having a little stamina left to dodge in a big fight, or just get another partial combo off instead. One of the craziest interactions with this relic is the fact that Executor's skill katana only uses 4 stamina per hit, so using the +1 variant of this relic makes his attacks literally only cost 1 stamina each, so you could attack for well over a minute non-stop without running out of stamina. I think for the 2 quick hitters plus Executor, this is a very strong S tier effect that just massively increases your effective stamina pool. But even on other melees, I think it's a solid A tier effect, as it will probably give you more effective stamina than a lot of the other regen or total stamina type effects would, even if you're using strong charge attacks. Because it also benefits from any melee attack, just like the FP regen effects, you can get a stupid amount of stamina back using attacks like Waterfowl Dance on Hand of Malenia, almost halving the stamina consumption, or other attacks like Morgoth's Cursed Blade that does a multi-hit attack too. So there's strong utility in this all around for skills on the bigger boys too, even if their stamina consumption per attack is higher. As for the relic ranking itself, I'd say it's a genuine S- tier relic for him to run, as all 3 effects are legitimately useful, with only the flame effect being slightly less so. The other 2 effects are very solid, with one being a must run in my opinion, so if you don't have other options with a +1 skill charge, this is a very solid pick, and it really makes Wylder feel fully activated with the ult and skill enhancements, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a trio of relic effects that brings more to the table than this for him. On to the final of Wylder's relics, we have the Silver tier, which is a large relic from completing part of his Remembrance. The first effect here is one that I think may be a little misunderstood, as the wording is not particularly good. When it says Art Gauge is greatly filled when ability is activated, it's specifically referring to his passive Cheat Death Sixth Sense activating, not using his ult or grapple. This will give you 18% ultimate art charge, and you can't stack the effect for 36% or more. This is an okay effect that maybe ends up being clutch for giving you just enough ult charge to get that final strike on a boss or revive your down teammates in a hairy situation, but the likely infrequency of this actually proccing makes this not very good at all. You could technically force activate this between every Site of Grace by purposely dropping your HP to proc the effect and then speed up your ult charge, but then you'd have given up your cheat death and you may actually end up needing it, so then you go down and now you've wasted tons of DPS waiting for a teammate to revive you, or your run gets killed in a solo run, completely nullifying any additional gain you would have got from the slightly more frequent ults. You could be a little more strategic about it by only doing this right near the end of fights, since you'll hit a Grace immediately after and recharge it, but it just feels tedious and kind of gimmicky to do this, to have to force it and eat hits, which is also going to just slow down your kills to begin with, rather than just fighting naturally. At best, maybe you get a couple more ults off over the entire run with this, maybe netting out to 1 or 2% more total damage, but with a higher risk of actually dying and making it a net 0 or net loss. So I'd say this is a D tier effect if anything. Second is an effect that is also probably a little misunderstood, and it provides you with a 5, 7.5, and 10% faster passive ult recharge speed, depending on whether it's a +1 or 2 respectively. This doesn't affect charging from doing damage or other sources, it's literally just the passive uptick for being in combat, so it's not nearly as good as you think, as this makes up a fairly small portion of your total ult charge, assuming you're actively dealing damage in fights. Even with a +3, I think you'd be hard pressed to see it actually even account for 5% of your total ult charge contribution, making this relic very shitty at any rank. I'd say a +3 is a D, while a +1 is genuinely an F, as you're maybe getting your ult up 1 second faster on average, and this will likely make 0 difference in a run, since many people aren't going to be ulting the second it comes up anyways in a lot of cases. Finally, for the third effect, we have a +3 arcane boost, which I'm going to use as an opportunity to talk about all of the attribute boosting effects to get this out of the way now, as they're quite common on these unique relics and all behave similarly. This set of relic effects is probably one of the most mysterious in terms of what it's actually doing, but if you look under the hood and understand that this is just Elden Ring with even less player stat information than we already had in base Elden Ring, then it becomes clearer what's going on. These effects come in flavors of +1, 2, and 3 for Arcane, Faith, Dex, Strength, and Int, and all of them pretty much just add that number to your Nightfarer's invisible stats, thereby increasing your damage on the respective weapons that scale off of those stats. The thing that makes these kind of garbage though is the fact that we can hit soft cap walls just like in Elden Ring, where as you level higher, the effectiveness of additional stat investment becomes diminished. And this is exactly what happens in Nightreign 2. I went pretty deep testing this, and what I found was that at early levels, you get much better increases to total damage output, sometimes going as high as 9 or 10%, but when you were leveled up to level 15, you'd be lucky to even get a single percentage point of increased damage for each tier your relic effect had, and that was when you were using a weapon with S scaling to the matched attribute. Realistically, you'd only ever be running this effect with a Nightfarer that uses that attribute for their favorite weapon types, so Strength for Raider, Dex for Duchess for example, so these effects will continually diminish in effectiveness the further you get in a run. Alternatively, you would find that slotting a +3 strength on Duchess would maintain its effectiveness more or less right up to level 15 because she has almost no strength built into her character stats and doesn't scale strongly off it up to level 15, but that's obviously impractical as you probably aren't looking to run strength scaled weapons on her, making this irrelevant. So unfortunately, this effect is a lot more trash than I think many people believe, and even though it does stack, it's pretty much always going to be worse than any of the more explicit damage amp type effects. The one thing it has going for it is the fact that it applies this damage amp across the board to all weapon types that you'd use that scale off that attribute. So it has a bit more of a broad use case at a heavy trade-off to total damage. That being said, I think the trade-off is too great as most of the other effects are 2 to 3 times more potent without too many more conditions to meet to consistently take advantage of their buffs. If you don't have any better options to run, I think they're fair game, but they're significantly outclassed, and I'd say they're a B- at best for any of these options, with the magic focus ones perhaps being even as low as C, because it pigeonholes you into a single type of spell or incantation to play with, whether you're using the int or faith-based scaling ones, if you want to get the damage amp benefits from them. Arcane would seem somewhat okay on the surface for characters who don't have natively high arcane, because it will boost your ability to build up status effects, but the difference it actually ends up making is almost negligible, often not even changing the number of hits to apply a status by a single hit, until you've applied it multiple times and the threshold increases so much to apply the status that you finally see a difference. Basically, if your character has high base stats favoring that damage type, they're going to get less out of it, and the higher level you get, the lower total damage it's going to give you as well. In Raider's case, you literally only get +1 damage per extra strength on an S-scaled strength weapon, and with a weapon with only B-tier strength scaling, you're going to get a single damage point, which is just absolute garbage. On the Dex side, it seems like this holds similarly true, though because Dex weapons are faster attacking, lower base damage weapons, a single damage point is usually worth more, so the Dex ones are a little bit more valuable. Overall though, by the time you hit level 15, we're looking at around a 3% increase to damage on a +3 relic, which is pretty pathetic. But on the flip side, you can get around 8 to 9% more damage in the earliest levels before your character's invisible stats start hitting soft caps. With all of this considered, the arcane boost that you get on the silver tier would be a C, and overall I would rank the silver tier at a D because all 3 perks are incredibly underwhelming, not to mention the fact that arcane is a heavily mismatched effect for Wylder to run unless you end up running a status build or pick up a solid frost or bleed greatsword during the run, which is RNG dependent. You just have way better options to pick from than this silver piece of shit. This first effect on Guardian's 3rd volume relic from his Remembrance questline makes charged halberd attacks create a small whirlwind that does between 30 something and 71 something damage between levels 1 to 15, changing slightly depending on the enemy being attacked. This can be as much as a 50% damage increase on his base halberd with no upgrades early on, which is pretty solid, but using charged halberd attacks on Guardian usually goes against his traditional playstyle of fishing for guard counters, and even his charged heavy guard counters don't make use of this effect, heavily diminishing how useful it is. That said, you can still of course use heavy attacks if you want to milk more value out of it. I just think it's not nearly as practical to do, making this a C tier effect in my eyes. Maybe if the damage was greater or it created a longer lasting whirlwind like his enhanced skill does, then I'd put it higher. His second effect is something that falls into the bucket of restoring HP with weapon attacks, which is actually a pretty legitimate effect that with fast attacking melee Nightfarers becomes incredibly strong. You restore 10 HP for each attack, which is actually a pretty solid amount and can very reliably keep you topped off at full HP, reactivating your full HP gear effects and counteracting health draining effects like the Executor specific relic that drains HP on attacks, or the Symbol of Avarice that continually drains HP altogether. It's worth noting that this does not stack, so don't bother doubling up. And it also seems like you can only proc it about once every second, so if you're attacking really fast, it's not going to give you 10 HP for each of those hits. It has a tiny cooldown. I do really like that this effect maintains its usefulness over the course of the entire run, and that early on it's very strong since 10 HP is a couple percentage points of your max HP at early levels, depending on the Nightfarer. Obviously, Nightfarers like Raider, Guardian, and sometimes Wylder are more likely to use slower weapons that don't make as much use from this perk, while Executor, Revenant, and absolutely Duchess can really take full advantage of this effect, and Recluse will likely never use it as spells don't proc it. As such, I'll give it a variable rating just for the Nightfarers that can use it, with it genuinely being an A+ effect in my eyes for anyone running quick attacking weapons. Well, it's probably more of a B- on slower attackers, though still definitely relevant, especially with how useful it can be in the early game. Because the third volume relic only has 2 effects, and neither of them is particularly remarkable, I would say that this is a D tier relic that you probably don't want to run. There are way better choices to go for than this. Next up is the Stone Stake from Guardian's Remembrance, and the first effect found on this relic greatly modifies his Whirlwind skill, improving the AoE and duration to last from around 5 to 7 seconds depending on how long you charge it. Instead of being a single gust of wind, it now takes damage over the course of that duration, while doing up to double the damage it normally would have, while doing small staggers with each tick, rather than fully knocking up smaller enemies. The stance damage is absolutely pitiful though, and would take well over 2 entire casts to do the same stance damage as a few strong hits from a weapon, but the constant staggering it alternatively provides is a great source of long-term CC that can fully animation lock weaker enemies and small bosses. It can also block projectiles, but I found it pretty inconsistent and it doesn't work well against a lot of bosses, so I wouldn't bank on that aspect of the effect working as intended most of the time. Overall though, I think it provides a very strong net buff to Guardian's kit that makes farming during night 1 and 2 a lot smoother, along with being useful for reviving teammates too, so I'd put it in A tier, but not higher since its effectiveness against Night Lords is quite marginal and the likelihood of a mobile boss actually taking full damage from the skill is incredibly low. Second is an effect that gives you cooldown reduction for your skills, and what Nightfarer wouldn't like a bit of that? Well, actually, Executor, Recluse, and Revenant don't care at all, as this relic does absolutely nothing on them. I think this effect is fine, but probably overrated as it only gives 5, 7.5, and 10% skill CDR at ranks 1, 2, and 3 respectively, which saves you maybe a second on your cooldown for abilities at most. This is handy for having a clutch skill like Ironeye's dash up more frequently, since it gives iframes when you use it, or Wylder's grapple to move around the map just a little bit faster, but for Duchess and Raider, having your skill up slightly more often isn't going to guarantee that you'd make use of it at all, since you're typically looking to tactically use it at optimal moments for max damage, not the second it's off cooldown. The likelihood of this increasing your team's DPS by any significant amount is probably less than 1 or 2%, as the only time you can count on it actually being useful is when you activate it before you would have had it up without the effect. I genuinely don't think this is better than a C-, but Ironeye and Wylder are probably going to make the most use of it, especially if they have a +1 skill charge to pair with it. In terms of an overall ranking for the Stone Stake, again, because it's a medium relic, I don't think I could really put it any higher than a C tier because we're missing an effect completely. One of them is not very good, and the other is just fine. First on the Witch's Brooch is a modification to Guardian's ult that can be fantastic for clutch saves during boss fights that makes Guardian's ult restore 10% plus 12 HP every half second for as long as you continue to hold your ultimate art buttons down after you cast it. You can do this to top up your team while they're still alive, or after they've been down to bring them back to full HP while being invulnerable in the aura, which is extremely handy for tough Night Lord fights. While you're not ulting every mini-boss fight, given that it's a bit slower to charge than other ults, you can still get some very solid value out of this over the course of an entire run, and it helps your entire team, which is triply valuable compared to an individual damage booster. I'd say this is an S- tier skill, but not an S or S+, just because you aren't always going to get the full value out of the heal, and somewhat infrequent usage of this makes it less impactful. Not to mention that using the healing aura drains more of your ultimate art gauge, so you don't get to ult as often as compared to just doing the damage blast with no aura. The second effect on this relic makes blocking attacks with Steel Guard create small AoE shockwaves that damage and do minor stagger damage. This seems cool on paper because you'd think that it would proportionately scale the damage based on the incoming hit, but unfortunately that's not the case at all. It's literally just a flat 60 damage that slightly changes by a few damage points depending on the enemy being hit by it. The AoE is not especially large, and there are many instances where it just won't hit the enemy who you've just guarded against, making it even worse. Sure, very early on it's marginally more useful since that 60-ish damage will be more impactful, but overall this is just dog shit and is an F tier skill that likely won't increase your total damage output by even 1%. For the final effect on this relic, we have a +3 to Vigor, which comes from yet another generally vague set of relic effects that we're going to pit stop to talk about quickly. In this set, we have Endurance, Vigor, Mind, and Poise boosters, all of which come in +1, 2, and 3 variants. These are slightly different from the others, despite them looking like they would behave just like their other stat modifying counterparts, in that they provide flat boosts that do not scale based on your level whatsoever. What you get is what you get. For Mind, you simply get 5 FP per rank, Endurance gives 2 stamina, and Vigor gives 20 health per rank, so 15, 6, and 60 respectively for maxed out effects. None of these are particularly game-breaking, but for early game boosts they can feel substantial. For context, using just level 15 as a reference, a +3 Mind Relic will give between 7.5 and 15% more max FP, that being lower on Recluse and other spellcasters who have higher base FP. The Endurance one only gives 5 to 7% more stamina, with the beefy boys getting less out of this due to their higher stamina pool, while Recluse benefits the most. Then we have Vigor Boost, which gives between 5 and 8% more max health, again favoring squishies over the beefy boys, who already have a large health pool. The Mind Boost is actually pretty solid and can be pretty handy on Recluse for making early game a bit smoother, as 15 FP will go a long way on Night 1, while staying relevant into the Night Lord fight, while the stamina and HP boosts are not as significant. I personally think you should actually only run these on squishy characters and never on tanks, because you get more than enough HP to begin with, and would do better getting some more damage or focusing on other utility effects to help the team. I'd put the Mind effect at a fair A-, while the Endurance is a B, and the Vigor is a B+, as it can definitely have a noticeable effect on survivability for squishies at all stages of the game. As for the final one of the +1 to 3 effects, we have a Poise booster, which supposedly decreases stance damage taken by 5, 10, and 15% respectively, though this is an annoying one to test, and my onion bro paid the price in the name of science to validate this. All of the other relics here stack as many times as you want to, so it stood to reason that this was the case with Poise as well, but I've read conflicting answers about how it behaves, so I applied a rigorous testing method of getting anal skewered hundreds of times by the training dummy to clear things up once and for all. It was very tough to say at first if there was any distinct difference between the relic being active or not, but I can say with certainty that not only does it indeed work, but they also stack too. At baseline, it was taking an average around 2 spikes to the ass to stagger the onion bro, but with 3 + 3 Poise relics equipped, it was taking around 4 to stagger instead. Using 1 or 2 made things fall somewhere in between, but it's pretty hard to give exact numbers on when you would hit new Poise breakpoints for taking extra hits, given the immense variability between Nightfarers and the enemies that would be attacking you. All I can say with certainty is that more of these will indeed make you more likely to push through a heavy attack. It's a bit difficult to give a really objective ranking for an effect like this, especially when it's so hard to quantify how much it's actually doing beyond supposedly reducing stance damage in increments of 5% per rank. But I'm going to say that I don't particularly value this on anyone other than Raider or Guardian, simply because damage or damage negation trumps standing upright in my opinion in most of these cases. Squishies should be avoiding damage, not tanking through it, so for anyone like Duchess or Revenant, I'd say this is a C tier effect, though it would still have some value in not letting more trash-type mobs stagger you in Nights 1 and 2. For the beefy boys, and possibly even Wylder or Executor, I'd say this is a solid B+ option, where you open doors for getting fully charged heavy attacks off on bosses without the risk of being staggered if you have enough of these stacked up, which would then give your higher DPS teammates more windows to lay down some big damage if you're staggering enemies. That said, a single +3 Poise didn't feel like it was making a massive difference, so you'd probably need to give up 2 slots for a noticeable enough difference to make this really come online and let you change your playstyle, which is why I'm not pushing this any higher. Finally, going back to the Witch's Brooch Relic, in terms of overall ranking, now that we understand how Vigor boosts work, I'd say this relic is honestly just a B tier relic, as one effect is trash, the other is mid, and only one is genuinely good. Of course, if you don't have any other relics that have Guardian's ult healing, and you want to be for the boys and run it, then this will be a fine option, but I suggest running just about any other large relic you can find that has it, and at least one other good complementary effect. If you're enjoying this video so far and are interested in more deep dives and analysis type content and tier lists, then consider subscribing. My goal is always to provide high quality, in-depth content that helps you become more efficient at whatever games you're playing, and you can trust I've done my research before I present any of my findings. Alright, so the Cracked Ceiling Wax Relic for Ironeye is only a medium relic with 2 effects, and they are both absolute horseshit. The first extends his weak point duration from 17.5 to 20 seconds, which is an absolutely pathetic excuse for a relic effect when you're playing with any half-decent team. Those 2.5 seconds may make a difference every once in a while to proc his weak point, but if you're getting reliable damage off, this is almost never an issue, so it's an undeniable F tier for me. The second effect is honestly one of the worst in the game in my opinion. You get a pitiful 300 runes for every critical hit you land, which over the course of the run would maybe net you, I don't know, 9 or 12k if you're really going all out on crit fishing, but I don't think there's any extra rune boosting effects that are worth it in the slightest when you have a competent team. It's way too easy to hit level 15 when you're routing well, and everyone is working together to the point where you have more runes than you know what to do with, so this is also an easy F tier in my books that adds nothing to the run, other than maybe hitting a level threshold slightly faster in rare scenarios. So overall, this entire relic brings just about nothing to the table, and you should never ever run it if you have anything even remotely better to run for Ironeye, and possibly the worst Remembrance relic in the game. The Edge of Order relic from Ironeye's Remembrance has 3 effects, with the first being specific to him, where after using his ult, thrusting counterattacks will do 20% more damage for 30 seconds. This is frankly very bad, as it's completely contingent on using your ult to be usable, and while of course your ult makes it very likely that you can follow up with a counterattack, that's not a guarantee, and your timer will have started ticking down as soon as you've cast it. You're lucky if you get maybe 2 or 3 ults off during a Night Lord fight, and a lot of people tend to save their ults on Ironeye to revive anyways, so you're not going to be activating this effect if that's your playstyle as well. Also, I'll be honest, I didn't even properly understand what thrusting counterattacks meant until testing some other relics. What this actually means is that when you use a weapon that does pierce damage, like a thrusting sword or bows, which also count, if you attack an enemy just as they're doing their attack animation, it's going to count as a thrusting counterattack, and you do somewhere around 10% bonus damage. This is incredibly inconsistent though, and very often when I've tried timing this, the enemy attack still ends up going through anyways. It's like a really shitty version of parrying or guard countering. It's just so bad. It's way too hard to use on Ironeye even generally, and you're absolutely going to hamstring your DPS trying to actively fish for these counterattacks. You should totally just treat it as a bonus if you're lucky enough for one of them to actually count as a thrusting counterattack. This is an F tier effect without a question in my mind. This next one is the melee equivalent of the spell type boost effect, and instead provides a 6.5% damage boost to the listed weapon type, and it can stack. So in this case, it's for bows on the Ironeye relic. This is a solid damage boost that can be reliably used for your specific Nightfarer if you make sure it matches with the preferred weapon type, like daggers for Duchess or bows for Ironeye. But I'm sure we've all had those runs where you just can't find a good matched weapon and end up going for something that generally fits your class instead. In those cases, you're obviously going to lose out on that bonus DPS, so this is not quite as good as the elemental type damage boosters or straight up flat damage boosters that work across the board, given that it's semi-situational. But when it does work out, it is as strong as a +2 elemental effect booster, which is solid. Given the choice between the two, I'd be inclined to take the elemental booster myself against Night Lords with a specific weakness, and then this one where that's not the case, such as fighting Adele. It does give you the flexibility to run both a weapon that the boss is directly weak to, and another weapon of the same type that could apply a different status effect, but with the increased damage as well, so there's another plus there. I'd say it rightfully also maintains an A- rank for any situation where you're running this with the intent of using that particular weapon type, otherwise it's pretty useless. Alright, this next one might be a bit divisive, but I think these next effects are easily S tier simply because they remove a ton of RNG from a run and are especially strong when paired with the Crater Shifting Earth. The effects that infuse your starting weapon with fire, holy, lightning, and magic damage are awesome for guarantee that you finish Night 2 with a weapon that will be useful against the Night Lord with a matching weakness, and with the Crater you can guarantee that that weapon is equally potent alongside any other legendary weapon because it'll bring it up to a +3. With Ironeye's Edge of Order in this case, we get a holy boost. The singular downside to this strategy is that you're going to have one weapon that won't have a passive attached to it, but that's far from the end of the world when it means you have a weapon that your character can maximize the value out of and that the Night Lord is weak to. I pretty much always run this on my melee runs because I've had more than enough runs where I end Night 2 with a bunch of great weapons, but none of them are specifically good for the Nightfarer I'm playing, and more often than not, I'm the only person who will run the element that the boss is weak to, so no one else can help stagger them out of their powerful combos. Running this effect with this game plan in mind also makes it easy to justify hitting a mine on Night 1, to grab a Smithing Stone 2 to pump up your weapon right away to further increase your clear speeds for the whole run. Even when the Crater is your Shifting Earth, this can still be worth doing despite it not making the final upgrade from using the Anvil any stronger. Better clear speeds for Night 1 and Night 2 is just too hard to pass up, and to guarantee that you have a weapon that the boss is weak to makes it an easy S for me. Do you feel differently about this? Let me know. Overall, the Edge of Order is a decent relic, but only actually has 2 or 3 effects being properly useful when you're going up against a boss that is also weak to Holy, and otherwise only one of the effects is actually good. Assuming you're fighting Tricephalos or the Final Night Lord, this would be a B tier relic since only 2 of the 3 effects are actually useful, whereas any other boss would make this a D tier relic to run, so it's not that great in all honesty. The first effect on Duchess's Golden Dupe relic enhances her restage ability damage from 50% to 60%, making it 20% more potent, which is actually pretty significant. Using restage optimally can make a massive difference in your team's damage output when used correctly, and while restage can only be used once every 12 seconds, if you've timed it well, you could easily be responsible for doing more than 20 to 30% of a boss's total HP with restage alone, with this effect only making that better. I'd say this is probably the best Duchess-specific relic effect, as it can impact damage in a significant way for your team, but it's still not going to be game-changing since it's not something that has constant uptime and has too much RNG tied to it to be truly outstanding, so I'm going to call this an A- effect. Second, boost your attack power for affinity attacks and gives you 10% more elemental damage from magic, fire, lightning, and holy, which is absolutely useful when you're fighting Night Lords with weaknesses to these damage types, and even more so when you pair them with having your starting armament deal that damage type as well for more damage right out of the gate. This also applies to weapon buffs from greases or spells that apply the affinity boost, so you can get some extra oomph from it there too. This is particularly good on Duchess, who can get a more than 50% damage increase just by using a grease type spell on their starting dagger, and if it's affinity matched on top of that, you're getting more than 60% DPS, so don't sleep on these effects because they can be incredibly strong free DPS for the entirety of a run, and especially so when you're fighting bosses with elemental weaknesses. I'd say this is legitimately an A+ effect to run in any situation where you're actively targeting a specific damage type to run, and I would definitely push this up to an S+ if you're going to commit to starting your run with an affinity boosted weapon. This gets even better when you run the Crater to turn that starting weapon into that beastly +3 legendary, which fully removes any of the RNG elements from this effect, knowing that you will always have it active, and also letting you get free damage immediately in the run when you start with that weapon type too. If you're not going to go out of your way to do this, obviously its effectiveness is diminished, but these are very easily satisfied criteria to max out the potential of the effect, and it can still be handy without doing this too, if you're just banking on finding a weapon naturally that's going to match the Night Lord's weakness that has an affinity to it. Despite being a medium relic, I do believe these are 2 very strong effects to run on Duchess, so you'd be hard pressed to find a relic that outweighs the strength of these 2 effects, so I'm willing to call this an A, even though it's completely missing a 3rd effect. Definitely run this if you don't have better options, and I highly recommend pairing it with a change to starting armament affinity, if it makes sense for the run. The Crown Metal Relic comes with 2 effects, with the first probably being grossly misunderstood, so let's clear things up a bit here. The description says dagger chain attacks reprise events upon enemies, but what this means is that during a dagger chain, if you hit one enemy twice, then another enemy for the rest of the chain, and you land the final attack of the chain, it'll automatically activate restage, dealing 2 hits to the first enemy and then the rest to that second enemy, but only at 40% increased damage, not the normal 50%. What it will also do is cancel any currently active restage, and if you then activate your native restage after this has started, it'll completely override it and will not factor in the damage that you dealt with the effect restage. It's just wiped away. This makes it significantly less desirable since you can't double stack restages, but it does leave your main restage free for use with your teammates more readily, which is a significant plus, as you could easily have had it on cooldown right before a big damage amp opportunity comes up if you didn't have this effect. That said, I don't think this is amazing since it only restages the dagger damage and not ally damage, but it is a legitimate damage increase if, and it's a big if here, you're getting a full dagger combo off successfully, which I think is the biggest weakness of this relic. You must land the final hit of the chain for this to work. That is all that actually matters here, but that can be easier said than done. So you lose a ton of potential from the relic if you're not consistent in doing this. For these reasons, I'd say this is probably only a B+ tier effect, but it's definitely not bad considering you could potentially be upping your individual damage output with this effect proccing repeatedly, since there's no cooldown on it, while saving your restage just for team attacks instead of hoping it's up when a big damage opportunity arises, which it often will not be if you just restage constantly. The second effect is improved dagger attack power, which we've already talked about before, giving 6.5% damage, which is pretty solid and we've established is an A- tier relic effect. So overall, because again, this is a medium relic with only 2 effects, with one of them being legitimately good and the other being kinda okay, I'd still say this is maybe only a B- tier relic at best, because you're missing a full effect. The final Duchess specific relic is the Blessed Iron Coin, with the first effect giving Duchess a 15% damage bonus for 30 seconds when anyone kills something during her ult. This seems like a solid damage buff, but let's keep in mind that the majority of the time Duchess will be using her ult is in a boss fight, 90% of which are against a single enemy, so the likelihood of this actually being useful is incredibly low. There are scenarios like farming the castle, multi-enemy boss fights, or clearing areas like ruins where there are lots of enemies that could make this work a little bit better, but it's simply not going to be making a noticeable difference in your overall damage output across the run, especially with how few times you're probably going to ult during an entire run to begin with. I can't really see this being any better than D tier. The second one is one we haven't talked about yet, and that's continuous HP recovery, which recovers 1 HP per second, which is just absolutely pitiful. Sure, it can help you in the most marginal way in circumstances where you have poison or rot or a symbol of avarice on you, but beyond that, it's doing next to nothing, and is doing absolutely nothing when your HP is full. This is for sure an F tier effect. Third is a Vigor +3, which we've already discussed, but specifically on Duchess, I'd bump this up to an A- from a B+, just because she's very squishy early on and has to fight up close with enemies, making this a touch more valuable. Despite being a large relic, the Vigor bonus is the only effect that's even remotely desirable, so I'd still call this a D tier relic overall, and you should definitely gravitate towards other options. The Torn Braided Cord from Raider's Remembrance has 2 effects, with the first effect being an absolutely goated Raider-specific relic effect that gives him 10% damage and 20% stamina for 20 seconds after taking damage during his Retaliate windup, which is pretty easy to do and very consistently applicable. That's a huge buff for Raider, and I'd argue this is his best relic effect by a strong margin, especially with how quick he can burn through stamina with heavy attacks. There's not much more to say about this, it's just a huge stat buff that's an S+ in my book. The second effect is just a nifty little +3 strength, which isn't anything game-changing, and we've talked about how it has diminishing returns the higher your level gets, but it's still a nice-to-have buff that directly helps him, and a little bit more so in the early game. Overall, I'd only call this relic a B+, simply because, again, it's only a medium relic, so you're missing the potential of an entire effect, and the +3 stir isn't really game-breaking either. The first effect is doing the heavy lifting here, but that isn't enough to rank it any higher here. You'd be better off finding the first effect on another relic and running it as long as it had anything better than the +3 strength to justify slotting it. Moving on to the Black Claw necklace, which you get for completing Raider's Remembrance. You have 3 effects here, with the first being an effect that heals you for 20% of your max HP for every enemy defeated near Totem Stela. And while this effect is nice on paper, the likelihood of it actually being useful is quite minuscule. Realistically, you're using your ult to either insta-kill trash mobs, or you're saving it for a single enemy boss fight, which means this effect becomes pretty useless since you're probably not struggling to stay alive against the garbage enemies, and against the boss it will literally only proc after you've killed it, rendering it useless. The only time this effect is even remotely helpful is in something like the castle, where this bit of extra sustain can be handy given the enemy density, or boss fights with multiple enemies like Wormface or the Demi-Human Queen, where you could actually proc it a couple of times in a fight. Overall though, I think it's pretty useless D tier effect, and the only time you go out of your way to slot it was if you happen to be taking the Black Claw necklace for its other perks, which are actually useful on Raider throughout most of the run and not just a couple of niche situations. For anyone who loves spamming their ultimates to bring some extra AoE damage to the table, this is definitely the relic effect for you. For every enemy you kill, you charge your ultimate arc gauge by 5%, giving you many more opportunities to clear trash mobs instantly, and help up your chances of hitting level 15 before the end of Night 2. When I run this, and even generally, I'll often just pop my ult on a pile of weaker mobs to rack up a few thousand extra runes, and because my ult now charges up so fast, it's a no-brainer to use this almost whenever it's up, save for those tougher boss battles where you might want to hang on to it just for a quick revive for your teammates. My logic though has always been that I'm better off using it and using it often to get myself leveled faster, so that I'm stronger and have more survivability, which then decreases the chances of anyone going down at all. But sometimes with teams that drop like flies, I'll show a little bit more restraint and hang on to it. I think that just about any Nightfarer can greatly benefit from running a relic that bears this effect, and both Raider and Revenant natively have this built into their Remembrance relics, which I'd say are almost always worth running anyways. I genuinely think this is an S tier effect that is massively useful in Night 1 and 2, and the only reason I'm not giving it an S+ is because it has no usefulness in Night 3, though it does more reliably prepare you for a strong Night 3, so the S is where it's going to land. The final effect is a +3 Poise boost, which we've already discussed, and it's moderately useful, and I said that for tanky boys it's probably a B+, which I think is still a fair rating. In terms of an overall ranking for the Black Claw necklace, only one of the effects for ultimate charging is really useful on him, and therefore I'd only call this relic a B+, but if you have nothing better to run, it's still fair game. The first effect on the small makeup brush provides Revenant with a unique buff based on which family members she has summoned. Where she gets 1 HP per second when Helen is out, 10% more damage when Frederick is out, and 20% damage negation when Sebastian is out. Helen's buff is pretty ass, but Frederick and Sebastian have a pretty significant offensive and defensive buff that is easily on par with most of the other top tier effects, and the fact that you can swap between them is an added bonus. One issue is that during the Night Lord fight, it's pretty common for all 3 family members to get absolutely obliterated, thus rendering this effect essentially useless until they've recharged, which may not even happen before the fight ends, or they'll get insta-killed right away again. Otherwise, during nights 1 and 2, you can count on this being more or less consistently active so you can enjoy these buffs. I call this an A because of the offense and defense switching, but definitely not higher, especially since it's usually not great during Night Lord fights. Alright, so in a previous video from the first week of the game being released, I said this effect was decent since it provides a team-wide effect of boosting rune acquisition by 3.5%, and that the fact that it stacks is also useful, but I think it's a lot worse than I initially thought now that the game has been out for longer and I've had a chance to test everything more thoroughly. As I mentioned before, I think any rune boosting effect is absolutely worthless nowadays, simply because you should rack up far more runes than is necessary to hit level 15 with a reasonably competent team. This effect is definitely better than other rune boosters because 3.5% runes for the entire team translates to something closer to 50k total runes for the team if you were to rack up enough runes for everyone to hit level 15, which is certainly better than any of the other rune gain or discount effects that I've covered so far or will cover in the rest of the video. So I still think it's pretty bad since it becomes useless on any run where you'd hit level 15 anyways, but it does make a much bigger impact on guaranteeing you hit level 15 if your team isn't quite as efficient, and this could help push you just over the threshold to max out and maybe pick up a consumable from the Night 3 shop as well. I'll give this a D, but nothing more. Again, we have another medium tier relic situation with only 1 buff being remotely useful, so we're going to give the small makeup brush a D tier overall. The first effect from the old portrait from the end of the Revenant Remembrance adds a powerful ghost flame explosion to her ult that does a pretty solid amount of damage. If you're someone who actively uses your ult to buff the family and your teammates rather than as a defensive revive, you're going to get a lot of value from this effect, and I'd call it a fair A tier. If you're more prone to saving it as a clutch revive tool, then this won't be nearly as useful, and it's probably a C or D tier effect in your eyes. The second effect trades half of your max HP in exchange for fully healing living allies when you cast your ult, which I think is an incredible team play tool that's great for adding some extra survivability to the comp, especially when both teammates are already very low and you yourself are too, so that your HP trade-off is minimized. Since you're invincible after casting your ult anyways, this is always fair game to drop when you're low HP, as long as you're careful to heal up just before your ult wears off. I think this is an A+ tier team effect that can really help make Night Lord fights more likely to end in victory. Finally, we have that same ultimate or gauge charges on kill effect that Raider's Black Claw Necklace has, which is a strong S tier effect. Overall, Revenant's old portrait is a genuinely very good relic to run with 3 solid effects that are even better if you're someone who offensively uses her ult instead of defensively. You would do well to run this in any run if you don't have a lot of other perfect large relics lying around, and I'd call this a solid S tier relic as a whole because of that. Now moving on to Recluse's relics, the first effect on the Vestige of Night from Recluse's Remembrance activates Terra Magica upon collecting affinity residues, which provides around 15% damage to sorceries, which is a very solid DPS boost that I think is, for all intents and purposes, going to be constantly active if you're engaging with her magic cocktail skill. It's worth noting that you can't re-trigger another Terra Magica until the first one wears out, so if you want the bonus, you need to hang around on that existing spot until it wears out before you reposition with another residue grab to get the new one. It's a pretty simple damage buff that is quite large, so I think this is a very easy S tier pick for the singular effect. The second effect is just a +2 magic attack power-up, which we've already discussed, which is pretty solid, but because the relic as a whole is just a medium, I'd say overall it's a B tier option that you'd probably want to swap for different relic effects that also have Terra Magica built into it, and 2 other complementary effects that are good on Recluse. This is still a solid option though if you don't have a lot of choices. Recluse's second Remembrance relic, the Bonelight Stone's first effect raises Recluse's max HP by 30% for 30 seconds after ulting, which is great for boosting her survivability given her squishiness, but if you're a generally good player, you usually don't have to be too concerned about dying with her if you've hit level 15 and have some sort of damage negation gear on, but this effect really seals the deal in making her be able to withstand powerful attacks. I don't think it's game-changing, and I think offensive boosts are typically better, but it's still pretty solid and is awesome if you're prone to eating hits often, so I'll still call it an A-, but no higher, mostly because you'll only have this active for a certain portion of a longer fight, and you won't have it active for every single fight either, given the cooldown time on her ult. The second effect goes hand in hand with the first, where ulting incurs blood loss, making you lose 20% max HP, but then you gain 16% damage for 30 seconds as a reward. I think this is a much better effect that gives a distinct boost to damage, albeit again only for 30 seconds, and after you get ulted, so it's not something you can always benefit from, but it's good nonetheless. I'd call this one an A+ tier effect. The third effect is a simple +3 int, which is fine and I think helps to round out this relic, but we've discussed how stat boosters like this are quite weak and scale poorly. This also won't help if you end up running Faith incantations at all. Overall, as a large relic that gives 3 useful effects to Recluse, I'd say it's a solid A+ tier relic to run, as it's quite rare to find a relic that is broadly useful in any scenario, unless you're very lucky with random relic rolls. But this one does a pretty good job of being generally strong. Alright, we've made it to the last of the Nightfarers before we start diving into the boss relics, and so let's talk about Executor. The first effect on the Blessed Flower relic from his Remembrance activates when Executor deflects enough hits to unlock the use of his Cursed Sword ability, which makes him regain 100 HP. This is neat, but doesn't scale especially well, however it can theoretically provide you with unlimited healing against the boss, but practically speaking that would never happen. More realistically, you'll activate this a handful of times during a run, in many cases while you're already full HP and gain nothing from it, and even when you do, it's not a crazy amount of health unless you were lower than level 7. It can be handy for topping you back off to full HP when you have a bunch of full HP damage negation equipment, or for regenerating health from using Executor's HP draining relic effect as well. Overall though, I think this is a pretty mid effect that isn't necessary and could be easily swapped out for something else. I'll call it a C tier effect at best. The second effect is a simple +3 dex, which is solid, but again this is a medium relic, so you're not getting a third effect to help boost the relic's total strength, so I'm calling this a D tier relic overall, that you would probably be better off just not running in favor of a large relic with some other solid effects. The second Executor specific relic from completing his Remembrance is the Golden Sprout. The first perk makes it so that his ultimate roar heals himself and nearby allies for around 13% max HP per roar, so at low levels this isn't anything special, but at higher levels it can be pretty legit. I haven't had a chance to test this in depth, but I've read somewhere that if you roar in a scenario that would have killed your character, it'll actually keep you at 1 HP instead. Honestly though, the only times I usually find myself dying in beast mode is when I stand on a pile of magma or some other giant AoE, and it seems to deal damage at like 10 times the rate and insta-kills me anyways, so I'd probably be dead there immediately after regardless. It's a neat effect though and can be pretty solid for keeping your teammates healthy while they wail on a boss and you apply a small bit of stagger and damage at the same time. As a standalone perk though, I'd say it's really not much better than a C since you're not ulting particularly often, and you're usually better off using your heavy attacks that apply massive stagger damage anyways. Perk 2 gives you 8 HP for every successful guard. This includes perfect deflects on Executor as well as non-perfect ones that drain stamina, but at 8 HP per deflect this is pretty peanuts and doesn't do anything special for me. I will say that it does help counterattack another Executor specific effect that I'll cover later on for each successful attack, so there's a bit of synergy there. Overall though, I'll say that as a standalone effect, this is pretty bad and I'd call it a D tier since you're literally getting barely 1% of your health back for a deflect at max HP, and not too much more even at lower levels. The third effect is a neat one that I guess is a bit better, but still nothing absolutely game changing. Upon hitting low HP, so under 20% max HP, you and any nearby allies will begin to regain 0.5% of your max HP plus 1 health per second for 50 seconds. This will keep going for the full 50 seconds even if you hit max HP, and going under 20% again will reset that timer. This is actually pretty solid and again can pair really nicely with that HP draining effect that another Executor effect has. Over the course of the effect, it's likely translating to around 30% max HP restored, which can be a solid boost to overall survivability, and you can proc this multiple times, so it might give you a full flask or more worth of healing during a Night Lord fight, and possibly for each of your allies if they're nearby when you proc it. This unfortunately can have the bad effect of pushing you back over 20% max HP when you're trying to stay under 20% HP if you're playing with a low HP damage booster or damage negation build, but if you're playing carefully to manage your total HP, you may be able to work around this. It's kind of a nightmare to do this though. I will say though that it can be really nice once you've procced it to keep you at full HP without giving up a flash sip if you have a lot of those full HP damage negation effects or damage boosters, as this can easily bring you back up to full health. Overall though, I think it's an okay effect that probably isn't going to kick in too often during a run, but when it does, it can be a nice little top up and has strong utility with max damage and negation gear. I call it a B tier effect, and the Golden Sprout as a relic as a whole is probably a B- as well for Executor specifically, because of the way it synergizes with one of its other best relics. While for other Nightfarers, I wouldn't dare put this any higher than a D tier, since perk 1 is useless, another is quite bad on anyone other than Guardian and maybe Wylder, and the third pick is okay at best. Alright, so we've talked about all the Nightfarer specific relics as a whole, but there are a couple other effects specific to certain Nightfarers that I think are worth talking about now before we dive into the boss ones. This next one has got to be the single best Ironeye relic effect you can run, and no one can convince me otherwise. Having a +1 skill charge on Ironeye is probably even better than the +1 Wylder gets, simply because you get iframes on your dash, effectively giving you 2 get out of jail free cards in fights back to back. The biggest problem with only having one charge is obviously that once you've used it, you have to wait to use it again, and sometimes there are big attacks that you want to dodge in quick succession with tight or awkward timings that having a second dash charge would make significantly easier to manage. It also does a stupid amount of damage once you start hitting the level 10 plus range, to the point where you can use it while roaming around to insta-kill trash mobs with a single or double back-to-back slash for a quick 1 to 3k free runes to help the team out. Obviously, it has similar mobility benefits to Wylder's grapple for map traversal, but I found it only marginally better than sprinting, unless you back-to-back use the skill, then instantly sprint right after with no delay. It's not a game changer here, but it does something. In general though, it's just amazing and makes playing Ironeye significantly smoother and safer, while upping his damage output a solid amount when you instantly proc a mark, then reapply one right after that. This is a strong S+ effect in my books, and I'd recommend running it every time you possibly can, if you're lucky enough to have it, hopefully paired with something else that helps the run. The final Ironeye specific relic is one that adds 300 poison buildup to his ultimate, which can be handy to use at the beginning of a fight and is pretty likely to poison just about any poisonable boss right out of the gates, to rack up a solid amount of extra damage if the full poison damage is dealt. This is especially good against Adele and pairs very nicely with other relic effects that hinge on poison or rot activation in the vicinity. It certainly isn't game changing and probably only boosts total damage output by a couple percentage points, but because it has strong synergy with other effects as well, and is generally useful, I'll give it a C tier as an effect, maybe a B tier against Adele, but it's not moving the needle enough to be higher than that. This next effect is pretty useless in my opinion, other than the fact that it can help take the heat off of you by making Duchess invisible and silencing her footsteps after landing a crit from behind. Most of the time, bosses are still going to be able to do their giant AoE attacks, or will be attacking a still visible ally, and you're probably going to be close enough to get caught by their attacks anyways, rendering this completely useless most of the time. There are instances where this will help you land some extra backstabs to lock up bosses where it's actually possible, but those scenarios are not especially common and are usually lowering your DPS by backstabbing anyways. It's not useless, but it's far from good, so I'm giving this a D tier ranking too. Another Raider specific effect extends Totem Stela's duration from 20 seconds to 30 seconds. Now this is a solid 50% increase to the duration of the totem, but is it worth giving up a relic slot for? I'm sure you've all had those runs where someone uses their totem right on top of a boss, and when the boss dies, their drop gets stuck in the middle of the totem and you have to wait for it to despawn. Well, congrats, now you get to wait 10 more seconds before you can pick that upgrade with this effect. Even worse is when the boss gets stuck inside it and you can't attack them, or you end up whiffing your attack bouncing it off of the totem. Sure, it's nice having the 15% damage bonus the totem gives you for an extra 10 seconds, but it probably isn't going to translate even into a couple percentage points of damage over the course of the run for the additional time that you get out of the totem. Realistically, you'd have to be dropping your ult at the beginning of every single boss fight for it to have any value, since a lot of boss fights in Nights 1 and 2 are over very quickly. It still provides some benefits, and this does apply to all team fights, plus it has synergy with all the other totem related effects, so I'll say it's a B tier, but I think even that's being generous. Now this effect isn't explicitly tied to Raider since anybody can use it, but it's related to the totem, so you need to have a Raider on your team, and this is one that is related to Poise boosting. We've talked about the Poise boosters already, and we know that you can definitely feel the effects when you stack up enough of the Poise boosters, and that's essentially what you're getting from this single relic effect, only it's only active when you're near Totem Stela. You take half stance damage anytime you're close to it. I would expect these to work additively with the additional Poise boosters, but it's honestly way too hard to quantify with no numbers to actually observe, and it likely doesn't matter too much anyways once you're hitting Poise amounts that high. In any case, this is a pretty solid relic to run for Raider, and I guess you could slot it when playing with a pre-made squad knowing that someone's going to play Raider, but that seems way too situational for me, so I wouldn't bother doing that. This effect will certainly help you get your charged power attacks off on a boss, assuming it's staying close enough to the totem for you to actually land it, but with how spastic a lot of bosses are, especially Night Lords running across the map every few seconds, you're unlikely to get more than a couple of hits off during an ult in a lot of cases. It's definitely a useful effect that makes dealing damage more reliable, but because it's only going to be useful during your ult, which is not especially frequent, and you have to be beside the totem, I'd say this is a B+ tier effect at best. A final Revenant specific effect is one that is fully for the team, as it gives all allies and the family a 25% damage increase for 30 seconds upon casting your ult, though you don't get the bonus yourself sadly. That said, 25% bonus is absolutely massive, and for lasting that long makes this a very powerful effect that with a competent team who knows to dump all their heavy hitting spells and abilities while this is active can lead to devastating results for whoever's unfortunate enough to be caught in your team's wake. I'd say this is an A tier effect that brings a lot to the table for the team, but because ults aren't always being cast and Revenant's ult takes a lot longer to recharge than most, this won't have quite as much as an impact as you might think, but it's very strong when it's running. If you do pair this with the old Portrait Relic, you're going to get a lot more value out of it since your ults will charge a lot faster. Alrighty, the final Nightfare specific relic effect is a neat one that increases Executor's skill damage by 8%, but each attack will drain 10 HP from him. This is a pricey effect to run early game, especially for a damage boost that isn't massive and only applies to his skill katana, which you likely won't be using for the entirety of the run unless you're doing some sort of restricted run. You can counteract this to some degree by taking katana hits restore HP effects, or finding some other effects from equipment or bosses that will restore some of that HP, but once you hit higher levels, this becomes less of an issue. It does, however, make running full HP effects very difficult to maintain unless you're not planning on ever using your skill katana, but then that would totally go against the whole point of running this relic to begin with. I really don't think you get enough from this for it to be worth using when you could just grab something that gives you even 5% damage across the board and will likely get the same, if not more, total damage output from it over the course of a full run when you factor in the main weapon damage you'd be doing too. I'm going to call this a C tier effect, honestly. We finally made our way into boss relic territory, so we'll go through them in the order the Night Lords appear in the game before we dig into all of the remaining relic effects and wrap this up, but there's still a lot to go. First up is the Knight of the Beast relic from defeating Tricephalos. The first effect is the stamina recovers with each successful attack relic that we covered at the beginning of the video, and it's a solid S on Duchess, Revenant, and Executor, while an A on all other melee. The second effect on this relic changes your starting armament to fire, which we've discussed before as being an S tier effect for runs where you want a fire weapon for the Night Lord you're fighting, like Caligo and Noster. This is, however, unfortunately a medium relic, so again, you're losing a third of its max potential, but these are two incredibly powerful effects when you're doing a fire weak boss run, so I'd actually still say it's an A tier relic in those scenarios, while probably only being a C against any other Night Lord sadly, since you'll just be getting the stamina boost. Next up is the Knight of the Baron relic from killing Adele. I have mixed feelings on this first relic effect given what a small percentage of total damage it accounts for against bosses, but it's definitely not useless. The base version of this increases crit damage by 15%, while a +1 increases crits by 20%. And while you can't stack multiple of the same version, you can use a +1 and a base one together. Sure, it's a sizable amount of damage, but let's be realistic. Unless you're running with a team that has a stupid amount of stance breaking, or you're actively fishing for crits, of which many bosses aren't critical without being staggered first, you're getting maybe 2 or 3 crits in per boss, maybe a 4th against a Night Lord with some crazy stance breaking. This also doesn't account for the fact that a teammate might steal a crit attack from you, and with randoms is pretty damn likely, so this becomes even less effective. Most crits aren't doing much more than 10 to 15% HP of a boss, save for some specific exceptions like critting a gargoyle with a strike weapon, or you're playing Raider or Wylder with a strong as hell weapon with matched affinity, and against Night Lords you're probably doing even less than 10 or 15% of their HP, so that 20% damage amp you could be getting from these crits isn't translating to much actual additional damage. It's not a nothing relic, but it's not much, so I think it's a C tier effect if I'm being honest. Let me know if you think that's a bad take, but the math just ain't math in here. The only place I could see this being slightly better and moved up to maybe a B is in solos, where a crit is going to do much more percent HP damage against the boss, but in any case your general strikes also do a lot more of their total HP, and you could have just used a straight up damage booster effect in its place, which would have also boosted the crit damage as well, only it applies to all of your damage instead. The second effect is another ultimate focused one that fills your arc gauge by 5% for each critical hit that you land. Personally, I think this one's just okay, mostly because you can't guarantee you specifically will be able to deal every crit against the staggered boss, and fishing for crits is also generally lower DPS than just wailing on enemies versus backstabbing them, though animation locking someone is valuable for your team to safely deal damage. The 5% isn't huge for something that you will infrequently land and is easily outclassed just by having more damage if you're looking for offensive effects, just like we mentioned with the last one. Generally, I do believe there is value in having your ult up more frequently to help you get out of dicey situations, or just upping your total team DPS by ulting whenever it's up, but it's not enough to put this higher than a B- in my eyes. I think Duchess will probably get the most value out of something like this since it's the easiest for her to milk crits off of backstabs, but Executor and Wylder are solid too since they can deflect and parry to create more frequent crit windows as well. For solo play, this could be pushed up to a B+, since you'll be the sole person critting, and it's generally easier for you to force staggers intentionally as a solo too. Third, we have a boost to stamina recovery speed after a critical hit, but again with a vague description of what the hell that even means. Well, actually, it gives you an additional 10 stamina regen per second for 15 seconds. But wait, how much stamina do we even regen per second to begin with? Well, let me tell you, I painstakingly tested on multiple Nightfarers at different level thresholds, both in a live game and in training, just to be sure that it was identical, and I can say with confidence that stamina regen is always 45 per second at baseline. Weirdly enough, it seems like it does take the tiniest bit longer to actually trigger the regenning though at higher levels than low levels, so I don't exactly understand what's going on there, but when it is regenning, the rate is identical. So back to that plus 10 per second, this means that you're effectively getting 22.2% faster stamina recovery for that duration, which is pretty solid, but with how infrequent crits can be without a comp that has a lot of stagger potential, or actively fishing for those crits, you're not going to be getting a ton of value out of it, especially if someone else is taking those crits from you. While you can definitely alter your playstyle to try and make this more viable, over the course of the run, this probably won't be netting you that much more total damage than if you had just picked up a pure damage booster instead. I'd say this is a B- effect at best. As a complete relic with 3 mid effects, I'd call it maybe a B+ tier at most that gives a lot to be desired, but it's not useless and does specifically revolve around a crit fishing playstyle that you can adapt your play to and get a solid clump of benefits from all 3 effects, which is better than a mishmash of effects that don't complement each other. We'll talk about the Dark Knight of the Baron quickly as well here, since it's very similar to the base version. This is a very shitty relic in my opinion that gives you the base and +1 version of the crit damage amp rune for a 35% boost to crits, which I already said is pretty mid in my opinion, and is usually just completely outclassed by simply having more damage from any other source that would inherently boost your crit as well. And then the shitty little cherry on top is the critical hits give 300 runes effect, which is an F tier effect. If you really want to play for a crit style build, be my guest and run this, but I really think it's very bad and would personally call this a D tier relic, especially since it has the crits give runes effect. Up next, we have the Knight of the Wise relic from killing Noster the Sentient Pest, and its first effect, Increased FP, is part of the pretty clear-cut trio of effects that I'll quickly talk about here. We have Increased FP, which gives 25 FP or 5 Mind, Increased Max HP that gives 100 HP or 5 Vigor, and Max Stamina for 10 Stam or 5 Endurance. This effect cannot stack as they're quite powerful individual effects, giving well over 10% in the respective resource depending on the Nightfarer, and acting as a souped up version of the more basic +1 to +3 effects that use their attribute name, like +3 to Mind for example. I'm going to put these each a full tier above the basic ones, so S- for FP, A for Endurance, and A+ for Vigor. The second effect on this relic makes your starting armament inflict poison, and I've talked about some of the other starting armament boosters, but I'll explicitly cover the status effect ones now, of which we have Poison, Frostbite, and Blood Loss. Status effects are quite powerful in select situations, so it can be tempting to take something like this right out of the gates, but unfortunately it's not very clear from the description that you're actually giving up damage in exchange for these effects. For all 3, you're actually going to deal 15% less damage with the weapon itself, but in return you get 35 status buildup tied to the weapon for Poison and Frostbite, but only 25 for Blood Loss. You would think that this is pretty horrid on slow, heavy weapons, but interestingly enough, after testing Frostbite and Blood Loss effects on every character, it would seem like the 35 and 25 interacts differently based on the weapon type, because you would think that it would take the same number of hits with all weapons to apply statuses, but it was taking 7 hits to apply Frost with a dagger, only 4 with a bow, and between 4 and 6 with all the other weapon types. Now, it's definitely a diminished value compared to weapons that natively have the effect, but the more important takeaway is that this isn't just good on fast-hitting Nightfarers like Duchess and Ironeye, but it's reasonably viable on anyone other than Recluse, obviously, because the spells won't apply it. At a 15% damage trade-off though, I don't think the poison or blood loss options are worth taking unless you're fighting Adele for a guaranteed source of poison, but I think the Frostbite one is the best of the bunch, and it provides a team-wide damage amp effect that should more than make up for the damage loss. With the 20% boost from a Frostbite proc plus the damage chunk, that's a legitimate case for running this if you're not trying to run a weapon that's affinity matched to the Night Lord's weakness, and you want to act as a debuffer instead. This holds value over the course of the run if you plan to keep the weapon, and at the very least gives you a strong open. Bleed is strong too and will definitely be useful, it just doesn't have the same team-wide utility to make up for the damage loss. But poison just isn't very good at all. For perspective, 25 blood loss is pretty bad, as Reduvia the Blood Loss Dagger has 56 on it, and most katanas have at least 30, while other bleed weapons have something in between these two. This is why I don't think it's particularly strong even on Duchess. You can see the difference really is half the number of attacks to proc it in comparison here. I'd put the poison starter at a D, bleed at B, but Frost at a solid A+ option that you can easily sub in exchange for not running a starter weapon that matches the boss weakness if you're comfortable not staggering them with their weakness during the fight yourself, or you bank on picking up that matched weapon during the run. Another interesting thing is that you can blood loss onto Executor's starting weapon for a Giga Blood Loss starter katana that procs against many enemies in 1 or 2 hits, which is cool, but I still think Frost is better on him since reproc thresholds increase with each subsequent proc, making it more valuable to use multiple types of statuses instead of only blood loss. As I mentioned before, don't run any of this on Recluse, it's not going to work. The third effect on the Knight of the Wise relic makes poison and rot in the vicinity increase attack power, which gives you a 12% damage boost for 20 seconds, and works if you, an ally, or enemy are inflicted with poison. While this is a substantial damage boost, it obviously requires someone to be proccing poison, which isn't going to be easy at the start of a run without running a poison starting armament as well, which does suffer that 15% damage penalty, so you wouldn't even make up the difference if you proc poison. You also just won't have poison permanently applied to a boss since you need to wait for it to expire before you can rebuild it back up again, and the total status buildup required is going to be higher on those subsequent procs. That being said, if you're fighting a boss like Adele where poison is valuable in debilitating him, then it's maybe a little more justifiable to run this, since hopefully your whole team will be helping to build up that poison or rot with you, making it more consistently active. Another issue is the proximity of the activation, which is very small. You have to be pretty damn close to the entity being poisoned or rotted for the effect to proc, so for Ironeye or even just melee characters who are trying to chase down a mobile boss, there's a really high probability you won't actually benefit from the effect on that instance at all, and will not only have to wait for it to wear off, but then you'd have to build up the poison or rot again too. It's just way too infrequent to be put in the same class as a lot of the other damage amp effects that have way fewer conditions to satisfy and aren't completely time gated like this one in bad circumstances. I'd say this is a C tier effect that you should only run if you're angling for a poison build against Adele exclusively at this point. Overall, this is a kind of weird relic that gives you FP for a poison focused relic that would normally only be good on melee characters, though Duchess can make a bit more use of this, but it's still not a great set of relics to use in general. I'd probably give this a C for the relic overall, and only if you're actively playing a poison build against Adele. It's not going to be very stellar against anyone else, even though poison is somewhat okay generally. Transitioning to the Dark Knight of the Wise from killing the Everdark Sentient Pest, we have a shockingly good relic once you understand how 2 of these more misunderstood relic effects work. First is the increased FP that we just talked about in the regular Wise relic that I already said was an S- effect, but then we have successive attacks restore FP. Now, successive attacks has got to be one of the most vaguely described effects in the game, and it can be hard to understand how it functions, even when we actually test it, so let's clear things up a bit here. First of all, only melee weapons or damage from melee weapon skills that use the weapon itself in part of the effect will count towards this, so no bow special attacks or magic spells aside from the spells that have you attack with a magical weapon, since those count as melee attacks. In terms of what defines successive attacks though, it starts at a baseline of any 6 attacks in a reasonably short succession, so around 2 seconds or less between each subsequent attack, and once you start to push things past 5 seconds between attacks, it starts to slowly deplete either an invisible status buildup bar or re-increments a required hit counter before the proc will happen, but they're functionally the same thing, and all it means is that if you wait too long, you're going to have to add another hit for the proc to happen. It doesn't matter what weapon you're using, so even Raider can use this effect. It's just going to be a lot less useful since, first of all, he has a lower FP pool and this restores 5% max FP, and he obviously attacks much slower with his ideal weapons. Duchess and Revenant are the obvious picks for this since they use daggers and claws, which hit quickly and easily proc this, and they also have larger FP pools, while Wylder and Executor can also make some use of this, though not as well. This can actually be slightly better than the FP restoration on weapon attacks effect that you find on gear for Duchess and Revenant once you hit an FP pool of about 120 or higher. Then it outclasses it, while it's distinctly worse on anyone else because their FP pools are smaller. Because you don't benefit from this much early on, but do heavily later on, I'm going to give this a ranking of A for Duchess and Revenant, but this is probably a C for Wylder and Executor and a D on Guardian and Raider since they attack slower and don't usually grab weapons that benefit from expending FP nearly well enough to justify taking this given their tiny FP pools. Alright, now this third effect is actually a sleeper pick for any Recluse players or Revenant and Duchess mage build runners. You get a whopping 18% max FP for each Sorceress's Rise that's released, and most maps will have at least 3 of these, so you're raking in an extra 54% FP to dump a stupid amount of Renala's moons on whatever Night Lord or Night 2 boss that comes your way. Since Starlight Shards restore 60% of your FP, this makes them even more potent too, so you can easily dummy just about any boss with this combo. This is arguably the single best effect you can run on Recluse if you're lucky enough to grab a powerful staff by the end of the run, which honestly isn't too difficult, especially if your 2 teammates are looking out for you too. Easy S+ God tier relic effect that I'd say is a no-brainer to run for mages. Just make sure you get familiar with all the different Rise solutions so you don't waste too much time trying to unlock them. Now that we've put the pieces together on how this relic functions as a whole, you can see that this is far and away one of the best spellcaster relics you could possibly run on Duchess or Revenant, and even for Recluse, it's a solid option too, despite not making use of the successive attacks effect. This is an easy S tier relic for the 2 mage melee girls, probably a B+ on Recluse, and then maybe a C on all the other melees, assuming you're planning to use your weapon skills actively. Very solid relic choice and one of the best complete ones we've seen so far. The Knight of the Fathom relic is up next, and I'm a big fan of this one. I briefly talked about this first effect when covering the Knight of the Wise relics, but I think it's worth digging into why this is a lot better than people may think. You get a straight 100 HP boost regardless of your level, which is a massive amount percentage-wise for your early game, and even late game it's still fairly relevant, especially on squishies like Revenant, Duchess, and Recluse, which would still give you between 11 and 13% bonus max HP on them, and just under 10% even for the tankiest boys like Raider and Guardian. So even when it's performing at its worst when you're level 15, this effect is equally strong as any of the 10% damage negation effects, only it applies to all damage since we're just talking about health. Also, since your flask scales off max HP, you aren't missing out on anything here either, though other effects that don't scale off percent HP will be slightly diminished. This is still a very powerful defensive effect that I think on its own stands at a solid A+ because of the massive boost to early game survivability it provides, along with being relevant over the entire run. Second is an incredible team effect that I truly believe is one of the best effects in the game. If you're a solo player, this will be an obvious F tier, but in a dominantly team-oriented game, the effect that makes items confer their effects to nearby allies is one of the easiest S+ tier effects in my book when playing with a full squad. This works with meats, and most importantly, bird feet. Having one person on your team running this makes it easy to funnel your best items to the buffer so that everyone can get a solid rune and item discovery boost against the most lucrative enemies in a run, giving everyone better items and a stronger chance of hitting level 15 consistently. For Night Lords and other boss fights, it's great to only have to use one Exalted Flesh and all the other buff items to get the whole team stacked for a big fight too. If you're a selfless player who jumps into expeditions with randoms, you'll be the hero of the run if you slot this in to help out the team, and hopefully they'll catch on and start dropping items for you to shell out to the whole squad too. Finally, this next effect is easily a top 5 contender for the single best relic effect in the game. For an average gamer playing with average friends, and even if you're a god gamer, this can be incredible for saving your teammates who find themselves sipping their Crimson Tears a little bit more often than you. This effect makes your flask sips also heal your nearby allies at 50% effectiveness, which is incredibly powerful for maintaining those potent full health gear effects and generally just giving your entire squad a much higher total health pool. In cases where a teammate gets hit once but only loses a small chunk of HP because they have negate damage at full HP perks, your flask sip should almost always fully bring them back to max HP, giving them their gear perks back without having to sacrifice a full potency flask sip themselves. Obviously, this doesn't always work out perfectly so that you can get the full effects of the flask sip while grouped up, as you can often end up spaced out during boss fights, but even if this only comes into play a couple times per teammate in a fight, you can dramatically increase your chances of success. This can also change up your playstyle to ignore an additional healing church if you feel that you can rely on your teammates to work together to coordinate heals, so you can spend more time taking down bosses during nights 1 and 2, collecting more useful gear and stat boosting effects, and upping your chances of securing level 15 and the shifting earth power if you have that active. There's also a really cool way to use this to its max potential by constantly healing your teammates while they eat damage during a boss fight. Let your beefy boys just go to town while you rotate sipping flasks, and your DPS can go through the roof. Or generally you can save those teammates by sipping a flask who would have otherwise gone down by committing to an attack that would have caught them in a deadly combo. Overall, I just find this to be a massively useful team utility effect that is really hard to beat, as it just offers so much for a single effect slot that opens doors for a lot of very different gameplay when you consciously try to use it. Easily an S+ tier effect in my opinion. And so for the Knight of the Fathom relic as a whole, I'd say it's genuinely an S+ tier relic and is a strong contender for being one of the single best complete relics in the game. Obviously, it's incredibly team oriented with some defensive properties tied to it, so you'd have to be a selfless player to run it, but I seriously think it's worth running on almost any character and that it can significantly increase your run success rate. The Knight of the Demon is actually a pure meme relic, but it's worth discussing why specifically these effects are absolute ass. The first effect is probably one of the most situational effects in the game by a large margin. After being inflicted with madness, you'll gain 2 FP per second for 25 seconds for a total of 50 FP. This is not even a third of Recluse's max FP and under half of Revenant and Duchess, so it's a pretty underwhelming amount that also hinges on you having something to manually proc madness or fighting against something that builds up madness, which probably isn't the best thing to be doing in a boss fight like the one against Libra. This is an effect I would never go out of my way to pick up, and I think it's easily one of the worst in the game. Thankfully, I haven't found it on any other relic than this one, so hopefully that continues to be true. The second effect gives you a huge discount on shop purchases while on an expedition, and while it does give a 20% discount, I seriously think that this is also an F tier effect. Even if you were to buy everything out of the Night 3 shop and you bought some stuff from the merchants during nights 1 and 2, you'd maybe spend around 200k runes at the absolute most if you really balled out, which would translate to 40k runes, and I honestly think that's trash. I'm pretty sure I've hit level 15 with close to 100k extra runes in more than 90% of my last 30 or 40 runs, and I'm usually just buying random shit from the shop and throwing it on the floor at night 3 at this point. 40k extra runes is not going to do anything for me at that point, and even level 14 versus 15 is a pretty minuscule difference too, so in a really bad scenario where you come up short after night 2, you also wouldn't be hurting so much that you really would have wanted this. After playing this game for over a month now, it's become clear that hitting max level and getting enough runes for the run is incredibly easy, even with randoms, and with a coordinated team, it's pretty much guaranteed. So giving up any relic slot for extra rune generation is actually F tier. Maybe if you're still starting out and you're really struggling to push your rune count higher, and if you don't even get close to level 15, this could be slightly better, but you're almost certainly going to benefit more from an offensive or defensive effect instead of this. I'll get another out of the way here too, as there's an even worse version of this that only gives a 10% discount, and that's obviously also F tier. The third effect on this relic is literally a meme tier effect, and that's using the cross leg gesture to build up madness. This literally has no benefit other than proccing that FP regen effect that we just talked about, but in a really convoluted way that I'd be shocked if more than a dozen people have unironically done in a real fight. It takes about 8 seconds total to sit down and get the madness ticking up, which does wind up pretty fast, but combined with the sitting animation makes it just way too sluggish to apply in practice. If you have some sort of buff tied to madness procs in the vicinity, this would be the one place it's useful, but it's so conditional that it just feels like a ridiculous relic to run and bank on in any scenario. This whole relic is just a triple F of shame. It is quite possibly the worst relic in the game. Next up is the Knight of the Champion relic from defeating Fulgore. The first effect is the final of those 3 big stat boosters, which gives 10 stamina or 5 endurance, and is very solid regardless of what Nightfarer uses this effect, and I said that was an A tier. Okay, the second relic effect is actually a massive sleeper pick that I don't think many people actually understand properly. The effect description is incredibly vague, and it simply says that guard counters do increase damage depending on HP percentage, but it doesn't tell you whether higher or lower HP makes it better. Miyazaki, you've done it again. So the way it actually works is that you get around a 50% damage boost to guard counters when your HP is full, which is actually insane and can pump up Guardian's normally pretty abysmal DPS by a massive amount. The damage then seems to linearly scale down towards 0 if you were to hit 0 HP, so you're incentivized to keep your HP high to max out the potential of this relic effect. Honestly, for anyone who can reliably take advantage of guard counters like Guardian, Wylder, and Executor, this is actually an S tier relic, probably S+ on Guardian, whose kit relies on guard countering the most by far. There's not much more to be said about this effect, other than that if you're going to run it, you should be even more cognizant of actively guard countering whenever you can, and try to pair this with the upgrade options that enhance your guard counters too, or have additional effects for using guard counters. I think this goes without saying, but obviously on any other character where guard countering just isn't practical, this is absolutely useless, but we're trying to keep the rankings here related to situations where they're actually relevant. Next up is Restoration of HP upon thrusting counterattacks. I have some mixed opinions on this, but generally I think it's incredibly bad on everyone other than Guardian. You restore 2.5% max HP for every successful thrusting counterattack, which we covered the mechanics behind in the Edge of Order relic ranking. For Guardian specifically, you can make use of the piercing nature of swords, spears, and halberds more than others when you're turtling behind a Greatshield, so it can be quite easy to get these counterattacks off throughout the run on him. However, anytime you do a thrusting counterattack, you fully give up the chance to do a regular guard counter, which makes the guard counter boost relic we just covered useless, or vice versa if you prefer thrusting counterattack. I guess if you wanted a bit of healing, you could opt to use these over guard counters and switch back when you wanted to deal some bigger damage and stance damage, but in general, thrusting counterattacks are more of a pain in the ass to fish for than guard countering with his passive. For any other characters, I think this is a horrid D- tier effect that hinges on you using a pierce attack to proc it, so only Ironeye can reliably do this with his base weapon. You'd have to find one for anyone else. Where it's definitely more viable on Guardian, but still not amazing, so I'm going to call it a B on him, and that's being generous. Overall, this relic has one pretty strong effect on any Nightfarer, a second that's really only good on Guardian and maybe Wylder or Executor if you guard counter with them regularly, and then a final third effect that is pretty garbage, so it's all over the place. I'd say it's a B+ tier relic for Guardian specifically, just because he's really going to guard counter often, and then probably a C- on anyone else, unfortunately. The dark version of the Knight of the Champion is a very different story that has 3 relic effects we've already covered previously. 10 extra stamina is a solid A, 10% attack power boost to affinity attacks is an easy A+ to S+, and then defeating enemies fills more of the arc gauge, which is also an S tier effect. This is a very good combo of relic effects that is generally usable for any Nightfarer that I'd easily call an S tier relic overall. Second last of the boss relics is the Knight of Miasma from defeating the Fisher and the Fog Night Lord, with its first effect being a very niche one that makes you invisible for 5 seconds when frostbite is afflicted on a nearby enemy or ally. It's realistically only useful on Duchess to give her some more breathing room to get her damage off without being targeted, but invisibility is pretty useless otherwise most of the time. This isn't going to add enough of a meaningful contribution to your run to make it worth slotting in specifically for this effect, so I'd call it a D tier effect as a standalone. There's that tiny bit of utility I guess you can get if you proc the invisibility on some sort of trash mob before hitting a mini boss in something like a Ruins, but most of the time this isn't doing anything particularly special for you. Second changes your starting armament to Chilling Mist, which is a much more valuable effect, as it will apply Frost Grease to your weapon while leaving a cloud of frostbite inducing mist after the skill attack is used. This has much more general utility than the Poison Mist equivalent we'll cover later, giving your whole team damage amp and slowing down frostbitten enemies as well. You also seem to get a tiny bit more damage per attack with the grease, but nothing noticeable. I call this an A tier effect that's useful over the duration of the run, and doesn't suffer the 15% damage penalty that the native frostbite buildup effect has. Next up is another bucket of effects that I'll give a general blanket rating, and that is the attack power increases when facing a status afflicted enemy. This applies to Frost, Poison, and Scarlet Rot, and you're given a 10% boost when any is active. This is a pretty solid effect that is relatively reliable to proc against most bosses, as long as they aren't immune to any of these specific status effects, which most aren't, so it can be completely viable to have one person on your team carry a weapon that can apply that status effect, and the whole team can take advantage of it. Poison and Rot over the course of a boss fight already provides a solid damage chunk, and 2 procs can usually get you through the majority of a boss fight, so picking up something like an Antspur Rapier can give you a very consistent upkeep on this effect. Frost is a bit more fickle, and I find a lot of bosses clear that status effect faster, so I'd say it's slightly worse, though Frost as a status effect is generally pretty strong, but this somewhat makes up for it. only reapplying it multiple times during a full boss fight is going to be trickier, especially if anybody is using fire spells that will wipe it almost immediately. At baseline, Frost lasts 30 seconds, while Rot and Poison last 40, so you're getting 33% more uptime on the effect with these two, not accounting for some bosses clearing these status effects even faster. Against regular bosses on night 1 and 2, these status effects are even easier to apply, so there's usefulness to this effect over the entire run, which is why I'm open to giving this a solid A ranking for Poison, B+ for Rot because you'd have to find an item that can apply Rot first, and then A- for Frost given its lower reliability and consistency in Nightlord and strong boss fights, especially if anyone's running fire spells or attacks. I'd say the Relic overall is a B+ since 2 of the effects are actually good and work strongly together, while the third is very bad and doesn't add much to the run other than the odd bit of safety, a little bit more so in solos I guess. We are now on the final of the boss relics for those that are currently released, and that is the Night of the Lord relic from defeating the final Night Lord. The first effect is a pretty cool one that gives you around 12 to 14 damage rating on the weapon you switch to, with one of the 4 elemental buffs similar to a grease that lasts for 10 seconds. It's worth noting that this will completely overwrite any existing grease effect, and it's distinctly weaker than them as well. This is a pretty niche buff, but it can be kind of useful on someone like Duchess or Revenant using claw weapons since they benefit much more from flat damage buffs like this, but the amount is smaller than regular greases. You definitely can't rely on it against Night Lords as a source of staggering them with the element that they're weak to either, and swapping every 10 seconds can be somewhat annoying, especially once you have a full inventory to cycle through to get back to your main weapon. The buff isn't nothing, but it's pretty gimmicky, so I'd call it a B tier effect at best. The second perk is one we've already talked about, and that's the 10% damage boost for affinity added attacks. This is a great perk that is very easy to run against bosses with elemental weaknesses that I placed in the A+ tier earlier. The final effect of this relic provides a 10% damage bonus for 10 seconds after switching your weapon. The Fel Omen Fetish provides the same effect, but they can't stack together. This is actually pretty solid, and while I've said it's annoying to swap frequently, for 10% damage plus the other boosts, it can definitely make a difference in your total damage output. I'd say this is easily the best part of the relic, since very few individual effects are able to provide a 10% damage boost, let alone 10% damage for any damage, not something specific, so I'd honestly call this an S- perk. You just have to be willing to do the swapping to upkeep it, which you can do by weaving it in between dishing out a full combo and then swapping while you wait for your stamina to recharge. So thinking about the Night of the Lord relic as a whole, I think it's genuinely fair to say that it should be an A+ tier relic, since you can very consistently get a straight 10% DPS boost from both the second and third effects each. While the extra little random boost from the first effect is a nice cherry on top and does have some pretty strong potential early on into a run. This is also even more useful on quick attackers like Duchess and Revenant, but it's useful on anyone. Boss relics are now done, but there are 3 more unique relics not explicitly for any particular Nightfarer to quickly go over. First is the old Pocketwatch, which you get from your first encounter with Tricephalos that gives you FP restoration on successive attacks and a +3 dex. So this will obviously be best on Duchess, but is semi-usable on other melee characters too. It's only a medium though, and the +3 dex is pretty mid, so I'll call it a C- relic, but it's solid for when you first start out in the game since you won't have many options to begin with. Second is the Besmirched Frame that you can buy from the small jar bazaar that gives the taking attacks improves attack power effect, which gives you a whopping 15% damage boost for 10 seconds after taking damage, which is refreshed upon taking any subsequent damage as well, though you can't stack this effect. This is a huge boost that you can easily milk while playing Raider or Guardian who have massive HP pools and to some degree Wylder and Executor. This is definitely not going to be as practical to activate on the squishier characters, but you will at least get some benefit after taking a hit on them for your HP sacrifice. Pairing this with the post-damage HP recovery effect can be a powerful combo for keeping this effect active without putting yourself into lethal territory, assuming you can get your follow-up damage off reliably and safely. It can be easy to activate this during nights 1 and 2 by taking a quick hit from weaker monsters in locations like ruins to proc the effect before fighting the bosses themselves, or taking small hits from homing projectiles, fire, and other weak attacks that many bosses will fire off outside of their heavy hitting attacks. I'll be honest, I haven't had a chance to see if Rot or Poison or the Symbol of Avarice is able to proc this, but if it can, then this would make this a goated pick in any run where you can reliably make one of these tick down your HP. For Raider, I'd say this is an S tier effect, Guardian probably an A+, and then A- on Executor and Wylder, then probably just a B+ on everyone else, just because you're more likely to have to be more selective in when you take a hit to activate the buff, given your reduced tankiness, but the damage boost is quite significant, so it's pretty nice when it does activate. The second effect is a simple +3 faith that is more geared towards Revenant players, which makes sense since this is the relic you need to purchase to unlock her in the first place, and that +3 faith is mid at best. Overall, this is a good starting relic when you have nothing better to run, but compared to large relics, this is still only a C- tier relic to me, as only one of the two effects are actually any good. The final unique relic is the Fel Omen Fetish, which you receive for defeating the Fel Omen boss in the tutorial. In case you didn't beat him on your first try, you can replay the tutorial by using the journal near the Jar Bazaar to give it another shot. This is surprisingly a large relic, but most of the effects are not very good. We have the switching weapons boost attack power that we just talked about in the Night of the Lord relic, which is fine, and then we have an effect that is part of a broad category of effects that I'm pretty confident all of us can agree is just straight up trash. There are 4 variants that all give you a 15% damage increase to the respectable throwable type, which, if we're being real, translates to maybe a couple hundred damage if you had an entire inventory of pots and knives and perfumes, which would maybe do, I don't know, a third of a Night Lord's health if you were soloing it. In this case, the Fel Omen Fetish is just for throwing knives. If the game let me pick up a dozen pots per inventory slot and do a pot only run, I'd be all for running this, but sadly that's not the case, so I can't do anything but call this a filler effect and give it the F of shame. The final effect is just a simple +1 vigor boost, which is fairly underwhelming, but not absolutely useless. But overall, this relic is not very good despite being a large, so I'm still going to give it a D rank overall. For being something you can run literally right out of the gates in the game though, it's still something you may as well run. After that though, just about anything is going to be better than this. If you're still here for the ride, I appreciate you. This is my most ambitious video to date by a significant margin, and I've spent well over 150 hours making it at this point, with all of the testing, recording, scripting, which is over 40,000 words at this point, and the edit itself. Consider dropping a quick like or comment on the video to appease the algorithm gods, and let me know if it's worth it for me to keep making videos of this level of detail and what you'd want to see in the future too. We have now made it through all of the named relics and their related effects, but we still have a bunch of non-relic specific effects that can be found on any relic generally. There are many hidden gems in here, with some being more well known and others definitely being sleeper picks that you need to crunch the numbers on to see how powerful they really are. I'll roughly take us through the remaining ones by order of offensive, then defensive, and finally utility and starting effects, with some shuffling in between where it makes sense thematically. Alright, so there's been a huge buzz about this effect ever since people caught on to how powerful it can actually be, so let's break it down quickly. For every Evergaol you clear, you get a permanent 5% boost to your damage, but you can't stack this effect to get 10% for each. Even so, most maps are going to have between 4 and 7 Evergaols, with the shifting earths like Crater and Snowy Mountain usually only having 4, so you can only get 20% more damage, but let's be real, that's an insane amount of bonus damage for a single relic effect slot that can go all the way up to 35% on the base map with 7 Evergaols. This is the single strongest effect in the entire game, and it boosts all of your damage from all sources with no discrimination. So you don't have to pigeonhole yourself to a particular element or weapon type to take advantage of this. It's pretty much a no-brainer to run, assuming the relic you choose that has this effect gives you room to run 2 other relic effects that have favorable bonuses to complement the run. Most people are probably going to default to using the one you can buy in the shop that gives you both a Stonesword Key to start, this effect, and marks treasure on the map, which is obviously a great way to start the runoff, especially with the guaranteed key, but I think it's worth acknowledging that you've pretty much given up 2 other slots that could have given you a much larger total boost in power if they were individually strong effects too. If your team is competent, you can usually pick up enough keys without the starting perk to open all jails, though there is still some RNG to it that can make that impossible. So my logic is that as long as my alternative Evergaol relic has an effect that would give me something equivalently good as a single 5% damage boost, then I'd rather run that relic instead, because I don't care about having treasure marked on the map, since the locations are fixed but random whether they show up. So I can scout it in transition to another location anyways, or if I clear a castle location to look for more Stonesword Keys, I can just reveal the treasure in the map room too. In any case, this effect on its own is no doubt an S++ effect that is arguably the single best effect in the entire game. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it got nerfed down the road because of how good it is, and I frankly think it should be. It should probably go down to something like 3% or maybe even 2.5%, because this is kind of just making every single person run the exact same relic loadout every time with this. One last thing to mention is that I think something this relic helps do really well is that it gives you a game plan for how you should plan out your run, since it encourages your team to route in a way that optimizes for hitting every Evergaol. The downside to this is that if you aren't efficient with the order you clear them in, you can end up with cases where on night 2 you have a jail that's outside of the first ring closure, and you might have to pass it up, so plan accordingly. So I just mentioned that relic that has the Evergaol perk, but also gives you a Stonesword Key right out of the gate. So let's talk about that one next. I think having a Stonesword right from the get-go is marginally useful in general circumstances, but most of the time, if you're routing well on the way to Flask Churches, you can hit the chest with a high likelihood of containing a Stonesword Key and open the majority of Evergaols on the map without needing extras, so I don't value this all too high personally. However, if you're running the Evergaol damage boosting effect, this is obviously a lot more appealing, and it comes built into that special relic you can buy at the signboard with sigils anyways, so that's a practical combo that saves you the hassle of finding keys while reducing the RNG of finding enough to clear all of the Evergaols out. It's definitely nice to have during runs where you have a nearby Evergaol, but not a location that could drop a key too, which can make for a more efficient run overall. All things considered though, I'd say it's only a C tier effect without combining with the Evergaol booster effect, but when you're going to be combining them, I'd bump it up to an A- just for the convenience and security it provides in getting the most out of one of the best effects in the game. And therefore you could kind of value this as a 5% damage increase if you wanted to objectively quantify it. This is the final effect that comes with the Evergaol booster relic from the catalog of relics you buy with sigils and can be found naturally on other relics, and it simply reveals all treasure locations on the map. I think it's reasonably useful, and it's often worth the short detour to open these chests up, especially early on as they have some pretty solid loot most of the time. They'll frequently drop purple weapons and other useful gear or other consumables like cracked tears. That said, the treasure locations on maps can be memorized, and while not every location will have a chest at it on every run, you can very easily pass close enough by them while in transition to locations to see if it's there or not, making the relic far less useful for experienced players. Overall, this effect isn't likely to make a significant difference in your run performance, and you can also reveal the treasure on maps at the small castles in the map room, so I don't think I could reasonably put this any higher than a C-, though it is nice for making it more convenient to loot those treasure chests. This next relic effect is quite similar to its more impressive cousin that increases damage after clearing Evergaols, only this one is for defeating Night Invaders, and you get 7% damage instead of 5%, which is pretty solid. The issue with this is that there's no guarantee that you get a map with Night Invaders, and if you're playing with randoms, I find most people are unwilling to go to the Cataclysm locations because they likely have some PTSD of getting rinsed there while under level. But if you get a pre-made team where you're all running this effect, you can get a pretty legitimate boost to your damage in a very short amount of time, on top of the solid runes and equipment rewards you get from taking them down, since I believe it's almost guaranteed that you fight 2 Night Invaders at any Cataclysm location. In very rare circumstances, I'm pretty sure I've seen 2 Cataclysms in one run, which could give you a theoretical 28% damage boost, which is kind of crack considering how quickly you can wipe these locations out with a competent team. However, given that it's RNG dependent to begin with that you'd even get 1 Cataclysm, let alone 2, there are frequent circumstances where this effect doesn't provide any value, which has me putting this into the low A tier. But if you do end up getting lucky and roll a double Cataclysm, you're going to have a good time with that massive damage boost. It's worth noting that this doesn't stack, so don't double up on this. While the damage increase you gain from using a grease item is reasonably strong, sitting at 10%, it only lasts 30 seconds and of course hinges on you actually having a grease item in your inventory to use. In many runs, this isn't going to be something you can reliably have access to, even if you're running other relic effects that start you with greases that are favorable to the Night Lord you're fighting, on top of the fact that it means you're sacrificing inventory slots in order to proc this effect. When it's active, it's nice, but because it hinges on something you will infrequently be able to take advantage of, I don't think I can put this any higher than a C+. Alright, so this effect is a funny one that normally is pretty dogshit, but there are in fact scenarios where this isn't absolutely useless. You gain 10% damage when you have 3 of a specific weapon type equipped. A lot of the time that's going to be a weapon you'd never run, like axes or whips, but if you're able to find one that matches the weapon type your Nightfarer would actually use, then it's semi-viable to slot this in and reliably activate it. For example, if you're soloing as Executor, you have a massively increased chance of picking up katanas, so a +3 katana effect would be fair play here, or if you were running trios with everyone playing the same Nightfarer, the same would apply. That being said, you're still going to have purple and legendary items dropping that have a much lower chance of matching since there's a smaller pool to choose from, and in a lot of cases you're going to want to prioritize the passive effect it gives unless it's truly a weapon you would consider grabbing, which is going to decrease the chance of this staying active by the end of the run. Because of the inconsistency of getting this online and messing around with passives, and the risk of trading off some really good passes to keep this active, even if you ran a matched weapon type for your solo run or with a trio of the same Nightfarer, I don't think I would put this any higher than a B tier, and if we're talking about running it with a standard mixed team, this is definitely a D tier because it's very unlikely you can get it active reliably. If you're running something like the whips and axes one, that is just straight F tier garbage that I don't think anyone is going to be reliably activating without really going out of their way. So obviously I have mixed feelings about these have 3 or more equipment type effects, but the one for holding 3 staves or seals is actually pretty legit. And when you're playing Recluse, this is a very easy condition to satisfy since you're often going to be running multiple staves or seals anyways to ensure you have different damage types to fish for magic cocktail combos. You get a full plus 50 FP for satisfying this requirement, which is a massive amount early on and can be easily activated after hitting a single castle and popping open a staff rack at the top floor in the map room. And if your loot from the more powerful enemies is generally good, you'll guarantee 1 very solid staff or seal to run by the end of the run, and you'll hopefully have 2 more with a decent passive that you can hold on to keep the active going. I'd say this is a solid A tier effect that is a cut above most of the other hold 3 effects. The final effect in the hold 3 of this equipment type lineup is the 3 shields effect that gives you 200 HP when the condition is met. This one is a bit harder to satisfy, I'd say, and is really only practical to consider for someone like Guardian or Wylder who can already justify giving up a slot for a shield to begin with, as shields are generally less common drops and they force you to give up spots for what could have been possibly useful weapons, seals, or staves with more desirable passives. At least with the staffs requirement effect, you are very likely to actually want to hold on to those items to begin with. Here, not so much. The 200 HP is a pretty massive buff though, landing close to 17% on Guardian and a touch more for Wylder, which is way more than any other HP boost effect is going to give you for a single slot. If it meant trading off a semi-favorable passive in order to keep this effect active, it would probably actually be worth it considering how hefty the buff is. You're just really going to have to commit to the build and rely on a bit more RNG on the equipment side to slot solid passives while maintaining it. This can be done much more easily in a team with comms, but with randoms, don't expect any help here. I'd say for Guardian and Wylder, this is also an A tier pick, but only if you're playing with premates with comms who can feed you shields. If it's with randoms, I'd say it's a full point lower down to B tier, and for any other Nightreign, I wouldn't even consider running it, unless you're in a team with comms as well. It could actually prove pretty solid on a squishy like Revenant or Duchess if people can help feed you those shields. Next up is a pretty clear-cut effect that gives you 12% more spell damage for a specific subset of sorceries and incantations, which can stack. This is a very solid damage boost when playing Recluse or running Duchess or Revenant with spells over melee weapons, but because it's specific to a certain type of spells, it won't always be useful. Some of the boosts are far less relevant than others, such as the improved Thorn sorcery version, since Thorn spells are generally not very good compared to many of the other spells and incantations, and you can't grab residues off it as Recluse, interestingly enough. If you're confident that there's a specific spell or incantation subset that you're going to run and can expect to have by the time you reach the Nightlord, then this can be a solid DPS boost, but fishing for specific spell types early on can be a dice roll, so you might get stuck with something suboptimal for the first half of the run before you start killing greater foes for purple or legendary staves and seals that would actually match what you want. Not only may you not get the spell or incantation you're looking for, but almost every single spell that comes from purple or legendary items does not fit into one of the buff categories because they have an even more specific category that they fall into. For example, Renala's moon spells are in the moons category, and the Erdtree seal spells like Discus of Light and Triple Rings of Light also don't currently have a relic that can drop that boosts them at this time. Even basic lightning spells like Lightning Spear don't fall under Dragon Communion since they're Dragon Cult incantations. Maybe this will change with future updates, but almost all the best spells and incantations that you'd normally acquire later in a run just don't seem to have a matching relic, or I've just been crazy unlucky after pulling hundreds of relic scenes. Because of the inconsistency in making this work well, I think that the effects that capture spells and incantations you'd actually want to run are worthy of sitting at A- since the damage boost is quite substantial, but things like Thorn sorceries, which are generally not good, are more suited to be in the D tier. Obviously, if you're not running a spellcaster build, this will be useless, but if we could get a Renala's moon boosting effect, then you'd be obliterating just about any Nightlord with Recluse, and I'd give that specific one an S+, but I'm not convinced it exists at this time. This next one is just a watered down version of the effect that improves guard counters based on max HP. In this case, your guard counters only gain 15% more damage, but it's not hinged on your current HP. The other effect, on the other hand, would have the same potency or greater anytime you're over 30% HP, which realistically should be almost 100% of the time you're actually dealing damage, so this is pretty bad. That said, it'll still be nice to run in conjunction with the other effect, because why not take 15% damage if you're going to be playing Guardian, and possibly on Wylder or Executor too, though guard counters are going to make up a much smaller percentage of their total damage. I'd say you're better off going for a straight up damage boosting effect for anyone but Guardian, and would call this an A- effect on Guardian, a C on Wylder and Executor, and a clear F on anybody else. This one is pretty interesting, and I think it does have a niche use that makes it better than most people might think. The description says you gain improved damage on your initial standard attack, and what that means is only your light attack will make use of this effect. That attack will get a 13% damage increase, while all subsequent attacks in a chain will do regular damage, or if you did a heavy attack, charge attack, or jump attack, none of them will do anything extra. It's actually fairly solid on characters like Raider and Wylder who use slow, heavy-hitting weapons. Early on in runs, there have often been times where I'm so close to being able to one-tap trash mobs that this would easily put it over the edge and speed up my clearing significantly. Not to mention the fact that a lot of times during boss fights, I'm not getting a full combo off on the Night Lord or boss, so I'd be proccing that initial hit in the combo significantly more often, maybe averaging that 13% damage out to closer to 4.3% total DPS if I'm doing 3 hits per combo, and more if I'm hitting less than that. However, since this doesn't apply to charged attacks or jump attacks, it's realistically going to be a lot less than that in boss fights, since you're likely angling for both of those type attacks as Raider to deal bigger stagger damage and possibly on Wylder too. So it's still not a game-changing effect, but in the early game it can help push you to one-shot threshold against weaker enemies a little bit faster, and it still provides a small increase to total damage output even against bosses, assuming you're using standard attacks semi-regularly. I'd still call it a C- tier on Raider, Wylder, and Guardian since it's pretty situational, but if you have nothing better to run, it's still legit. I wouldn't run this on anyone else though, and it would definitely be an F or D tier option given how much faster other Nightfarers attack, and it doesn't work with bows or spells. Pretty clear cut here, Roar and Breath attacks get a 15% damage bonus, but I think it's fair to say that fishing specifically for a Roar or Breath build is not something you can necessarily guarantee. That said, 15% damage is pretty significant, so if you're playing Recluse, Revenant, or Duchess, you can make this viable if you pick up a solid Breath attack, but that can take a while, so its effectiveness likely won't persist through the whole run, so I'd say it can only grab a B+ ranking due to the inconsistency of getting it online, and therefore how long it's useful for despite being a large buff. I typically believe consistency and reducing variability is better than larger buffs with more conditions to satisfy. These next two effects functionally behave the same, just one for two-handing and the other for power stancing matching weapon. So 2 of them, not wielding claws or fists, as that actually counts as two-handing when you pull both of them out. The effect provides 5% more stance damage, which is a pretty paltry amount in my opinion, considering you could easily just trade that for a straight up damage boost of a greater number, but you can at least stack this for 15% more total stance breaking, which can be nice on Raider or Wylder when Oonga Boongaing with power stancing. Personally though, I think this is underwhelming and would maybe get your team one more crit over the course of an entire Night Lord battle, and it requires you to full commit to stance breaking attacks versus higher DPS combos from your standard attacks. With flat damage boost, you can do whatever you want and get the full effect of it. So I think it's only fair to call this a C tier effect. It's useful, but there are better options. Moving on to some more defensive effects, this next one heals your allies for 20 health for every enemy killed, but not yourself. This is another effect that has little to no usefulness against bosses, but in general clearing, especially early on into a run, it can be somewhat useful, especially if your teammates are slotting in gear perks that rely on them being full health, like increased attack power or damage negation at full HP. Later into a run, this becomes less useful because your health will scale to a point where 20 HP is peanuts, but this isn't terrible, so I'm still willing to give it a C. So this one has a pretty misleading description and says, draws enemy attention while guarding, but it actually only works when you successfully guard an attack, not just holding down the guard button. You seem to build up more aggression towards yourself with each attack you guard, but there's no guarantee that any particular guarded attack will switch the aggro to you. This is really only something you would ever run on Guardian or Executor to help take the heat off your teammates, but you need to be actively guarding constantly, so Guardian is probably the only one who will likely get full effectiveness out of this. Even so, I still think it's a pretty mid effect that won't add much to the team. It can be nice if you have a Recluse with long wind-up spells to have a slightly better chance of getting them off and not being aggroed while they unleash hell on the Night Lord. This is definitely a D tier because it's very unlikely you can get it active reliably. I'm going to blanket statement cover these next 4 relic effects since the situational usefulness for them will be the same regardless of which one we're talking about. For specific affinity damage negation, you get 10% damage reduction, which if it behaves anything like Elden Ring and the Souls games will be a multiplicative effect that is calculated against your base affinity resistances. So if you had a 40% base fire reduction, the 10% damage reduction would further increase it to 44%, not 50%. This isn't terrible, but it isn't anything especially game-changing. However, damage reduction is damage reduction, and it could be the difference between surviving a lethal blow that could have killed your run, or dramatically slowed down your Knights 1 and 2. Since bosses typically only attack with a couple of damage types, it can be easy to slot these in if you're killing a specific boss to give yourself a bit of an extra edge against them. So I'd say this fairly sits in the B tier for modest defensive properties, but I wouldn't be going out of my way to slot for it specifically when offensive options are typically more valuable than defensive in Nightreign. It's worth mentioning that there's supposed to be another 10% damage reducing effect for physical damage, but it's currently unreleased. I think this one is a little better as it broadly reduces more damage than a specific affinity type of damage, so I'd put that one up at a B+ compared to the others. FP Restoration with weapon attacks is a situationally useful effect that only makes sense to take on characters where you're consistently casting skills or spells to gain 1 FP for each attack, which isn't a whole lot, but it can add up pretty quick. For Duchess or Revenant, this can be a solid effect for building some FP generation into their builds to also cast spells, or even on characters like Executor or Wylder who can pick up strong items like Morgoth's Cursed Blade or Hand of Melania, which do solid damage and also apply multiple hits during their activation too, which would refund some of the FP from the cast itself. I don't think this is an especially good effect to run unless you intend to use skills and spells, but if it's part of your game plan, then this can be very solid, and I'd call it an A on Duchess and Revenant, and a B on Wylder and Executor, and then probably just a C on Raider and Guardian. This silly little effect restores HP from eating cured meats and boluses, which is incredibly underwhelming as it only restores 20 HP for each item you consume. This is definitely one of the worst effects in the game given how situational it is and the infrequency of when it would be relevant on top of just being ass generally, so it's an easy F tier for me. I have some mixed opinions on this next one, but I'm generally positive about any damage negation effect. Typically, I favor effects that reduce damage while at full HP because you're obviously less likely to die in those circumstances and can use things like the rally mechanic or other small heals to hit full HP again without giving up precious flash sips, but the opposite end where you get damage negation at low HP is solid as well. This effect gives you 25% damage negation when under 20% HP, which is a pretty legitimate boost that can be stacked with other damage negation effects. Though I do believe they individually act multiplicatively against your base number, not additively, and I believe they cap out at 80% if they follow Elden Souls rules. For tankier characters that are expecting to take hits like Raider and even Guardian, low HP effects are often better than full HP, but the important thing to know about damage negation at low HP is that it only kicks in after you've gone under 20% HP. It won't do an in-between step when calculating damage on the hit that brings you under 20% HP, so you're still heavily at risk of going down without it ever activating if your HP pool isn't large enough to tank the hit and put you in that sweet spot. This also means that healing yourself back over that amount is going to bring that risk factor in again immediately, so it's pretty tough to actually make this work without using small heals and being very careful to stay under that threshold, because being at 21% HP against the Night Lord is probably going to end up being a death sentence. A good way to work around this could be using Warming Stones to get you close to 20% HP again, but running away from it after you get close to the limit, or you just make sure that you're eating hits 24/7 when you reach that sweet spot to keep things low. But this is also going to rely heavily on you having multiple sources of damage negation at low HP to be able to withstand a large combo while you're in the red zone. I think this effect is still solid, but for it to be truly useful, you probably need to be one of the beefier characters and have 1 or 2 additional sources of damage negation at low HP for this to actually be viable, which is quite a few conditions. For those reasons, I think it's really only a B tier effect that would seldom come in handy, but maybe helps you clutch a run here and there, but purely from RNG and not intention. Next is another relic effect that I think is incredibly powerful with the right Nightfarer. This is pretty much the rally mechanic from Bloodborne, where you're able to recover HP back by dealing damage with melee attacks up to the pale red portion on your HP bar. So unfortunately, Ironeye and Recluse can't make use of this. For those that can though, it's an amazing relic to pair with any full HP damage negation or attack boosting equipment effects, especially when the damage negation is heavily stacked, making it even easier to bring yourself back up to full HP. You can easily face tank a lot of trash enemies and weaker bosses with this active as well, as your damage can often outpace incoming damage well enough that you can expend all of your stamina while eating hits before you have to back off to regen and then heal, or try to go back in quickly to regain a little more of that health back. I find this to be best on Duchess personally, but it works reasonably well on all the melee characters, with Guardian probably being the worst suited to use it just because of his playstyle and generally lower DPS that can't recover enough HP back, usually to make it practical. While this doesn't directly boost your damage per hit, because you can get away with eating hits and recovering to full HP more often to get full HP damage amp effects, you're indirectly upping your DPS, sometimes by significant amounts. So I think this is at least an A tier effect on all the melee characters except for Guardian, where I'd place it at a B and an A+ for Duchess specifically. We've got another selfless player relic effect here that boosts stamina recovery for all allies by 4 per second if they're nearby. Since base regen is 45 per second, this is a little less than a 9% stamina regen boost at baseline, which is not bad, but it's really not that crazy and requires everyone to be fairly close to you for it to kick in. This is definitely better when you're playing a full comp of melees, but for those with an Ironeye or Recluse, the Relic is going to be a lot less valuable and definitely worse to run on them specifically as well. This is probably a C+ tier for all the melee characters, with Guardian and Raider probably being the best to run this on since they have lower DPS anyways, so a team effect is more valuable. While for Ironeye and Recluse, I'd say this is a D. Alright, now this is a defensive effect that I actually think is legitimately very good. After being knocked back, you receive a buff that reduces damage and stance damage taken by 20% for 30 seconds, which is pretty cracked. A large percentage of bosses are able to proc this, and with a 30-second duration, there's a realistic chance of it lasting long enough for you to get whopped all over again and reproc it if you're struggling in a boss fight. 20% is a large amount too, and with the extra Poise boost, this is a really strong effect to run on all melee characters. Squishies and spellcasters won't get as much benefit from this, but the 20% damage negation is 20% damage negation, am I right? Even better is that it doesn't discriminate between low or full HP, it's just a straight up damage reduction buff. The only real drawback to this is that obviously it's situational as to what can proc it, but realistically this effect is going to be kicking in at every single fight that actually counts to have a buff like this. You'll also probably be alright not having it proc against trash mobs since they're not going to be killing you anyways. If it were slightly easier to activate, I'd call this an S tier effect, but I think it's fair to lump this in as a solid A given how large of a defensive boost it provides. Next we've got Successful Guarding charges the ultimate arc gauge, which gives you 1% for each successful guard. While this is not stackable, it's honestly really solid on Guardian or Executor, but that's about it. If you're properly interacting with their skills and guarding often, you're going to be getting some legitimate value out of this effect and will be able to ult in a lot more fights than normal. While it may not bring your total DPS that much higher, just knowing you can get your ult back faster in fights like the Night 2 boss or Night Lord will inherently increase your run success chance, making this a strong effect that is probably worthy of a B+ rank, but only on Guardian and Executor. This is pretty much F tier garbage on just about anyone else, other than maybe Wylder. On the flip side, this one is very marginally useful in that it gives you a plus 75 resistance for a particular ailment, but 9 times out of 10, you probably don't need to bother slotting this over something else more useful. For fights like Libra, Maris, Caligo, Noster, and to a minor degree the true Night Lord himself, it can be somewhat valuable having a little extra resistance before going up against them, but it's pretty likely you'll have an opportunity to munch on some boluses during the run to up your resistances, or take a single resistance up upgrade from a weaker boss, and that is almost always enough to get your resistance high enough to not have to worry about the status effects during the Night Lord fights. Even if you weren't lucky enough to have that happen, most of these status effects are not debilitating enough to be a major concern unless you're really getting your ass beat during these fights anyways, and if that's the case, your run is probably not likely to succeed anyways because you're not engaging with the boss mechanics properly. This isn't useless, but it's pretty close to it, with the majority of effects heavily outclassing this. Not to mention that they provide next to zero value until the Night Lord fight, or maybe 1 or 2 other boss fights that match that status buildup. Easy D- for me. We've already covered a couple of these with the named relics, but we still got a ton of different starting effects to cover here, with some being genuinely OP and others being pretty underwhelming, so let's dig in. Keep in mind, many of these just can't be applied for Recluse or Ironeye as they require a specific type of melee weapon, while some are only for bows as well. First we have Bloodblade, which is a pretty decent starter that coats your armament in blood while damaging you slightly, and then flinging a blood projectile for a small FP cost. You can fire it pretty quickly, and it does solid damage and blood loss status buildup, making your early game damage very solid and possible to deal at a distance, even as a close-up melee character. On Executor, he seems to do more damage with this than other characters as well, which I found interesting, but I can't necessarily explain it. Maybe it's because it was using a katana, but in any case, it's pretty strong on anyone for early game, but it's unlikely you'll make use of it to the end of the run as better options become available to use your FP on. I'd say this is a solid B tier effect though, given its significant damage output and the fact that it can proc blood loss too. Seppuku is up next, and I'd say it's generally good on most characters, given that it applies bleed to your weapon and it gives a solid boost to damage, especially early game. This skill really shines on Executor specifically too. Since his passive relies on recovering from status effects, this is the only way to reliably and actively make his passive useful. You get a full 20% damage boost plus increased stamina regen for 20 seconds, which is nothing to scoff at, making this very handy to have on demand. Applying innate blood loss to a weapon that you may have already infused with a preferred starting element to match a boss's weakness is a double whammy and makes it fully justified for hanging on to for the final fight, for some extra DPS, and even using it throughout the run itself. For almost any character that can run this, I'd say it's an easy A, but for Executor, it's actually an S+ effect without question. Flaming Strike is another armament coating spell that shoots a wall of flame out in front of you with a strong follow-up attack, and it'll give a Fire Grease equivalent coating of plus 21 at base, making it pretty useful for fighting Fire Night Lords and heavily increasing Duchess's DPS given the flat damage boost it provides, though it's a noticeable boost on anyone using it early on. The spell itself isn't particularly strong, though it does apply some solid stagger damage when the follow-up hit lands, but the spell isn't the star of the show here, it's that grease coating that makes it so powerful. It's kind of insane, but you can get anywhere from a 25% to 67% increase in damage per hit, depending on the weapon this is applied to, and for all intents and purposes, you can pretty much permanently have this running since the FP cost is so low. Of course, that's at level 1, but even on a Wylder at level 15, applying a grease effect to a purple tier weapon to simulate a fully upgraded starter weapon, I was still getting 14% more damage per hit, which is kind of insane. You're absolutely sleeping on this if you think they're trash, because they're absolutely skyrocketing your DPS at the start of a run, and it remains completely relevant into the Night Lord fight, especially so if you match it to their weakness, far surpassing any singular damage boosting effect. I think literally the only thing that outclasses this is the Evergaol effect, if you stack more than 3 or 4 Evergaols with it. I won't spend time talking about the lightning or holy versions of this, as they're functionally the same other than the spell attack, which is just slightly different but also relatively solid. But these are all genuinely S+ tier for me, no matter what character is running it on their starting weapons, assuming they can. If you have this, run it, trust me. Unfortunately, you can't use this on Guardian, Revenant, Ironeye, or Recluse, but the other 4 should definitely take advantage of this. Even Raider, who typically sees it scale from 25% to 7% by level 15, so it's definitely worse on him, but the early game oomph he gets can make up for it, and this isn't even accounting for the extra 50% you usually get for using a matched element against a Night Lord that's weak to it, so that 7% damage will bump up to 10.5%, making it still better than most relics, even on the worst Nightfarer to run this on. Thunderbolt is at best a very mediocre starting skill that does minimal damage unless the enemy is weak to lightning attacks. It could be marginally useful against Maris or Fulgore to have a lightning attack you can use at a distance, but you're just so much better off using Lightning Slash instead if you have it. The only minor plus of this is that Revenant can also use this, as she can't use the other elemental strike spells on her starting clause. I still think this is pretty ass though, and would call it a C- tier effect, with the only thing holding it back from being a D is that it's slightly useful early on as a safe source of ranged damage. Quickstep has been a niche skill since the Dark Souls days, giving you the ability to do a small dash with iframes no matter what kind of gear you are wearing, and letting you move through poison swamps with ease for a very small FP cost. In Nightreign, however, this skill is not nearly as useful, and to give up a relic slot for this effect when there are many other very powerful starting armaments to choose from makes this a pretty weak pick overall. Most characters don't need Quickstep anyways, since their kits have a good enough dash or roll to begin with, but if you really wanted to put it on someone, go nuts. I think it's a complete waste of a skill when the skills that grease your armament are incredibly powerful, and some of the other skills have great mob clearing potential, so I'd call this a D tier effect. Gravitas as a starting skill is pretty mediocre compared to the other AoE type skills, as the damage it does isn't anywhere close to something like Hoarfrost Stomp, and it doesn't apply any status effect either. It can pull certain enemies in though, which provides momentary CC, but overall I think this is another D tier option. I'll keep this brief, but Arrow Rain is absolute dog shit unless you're using it on an enemy who isn't moving and is massive, but even if you meet those conditions, it's slow as hell to fire and keeps you completely open to getting pummeled during the windup. If by some miracle all 12 arrows land, you can do some decent damage, but you could probably have done exactly the same damage by simply attacking normally, but more safely. Just run something else, F tier. Endure is a legitimate defensive skill that massively reduces damage during the cast, while also boosting Poise, but the reality is that you have no business running this on anyone other than Raider, and this is the skill he gets by default on his weapon anyways. You're almost always going to be better off just dodging an attack rather than tanking it with Endure, so this shouldn't be ran on anyone else. And even on Raider, I find myself rarely using this since his skill basically does the same thing, but with the massive stance breaking and damage tied to it. For Raider alone, this is probably a B tier skill, but you're probably going to get more value out of a different skill than this on him, and you're only ever going to use Endure over his skill if it was on cooldown, and you really wanted to tank it instead of dodging it. F tier on everyone else, no question. Determination is an alright skill that empowers your next attack with around 60% damage, but since we've already gone over how strong most of the other skills are in terms of straight up damage amp, this gets immensely outclassed. Since it only works for a single attack, this is useless on anyone who attacks quickly, and it's arguably only semi-viable on Raider or Wylder, maybe Guardian, but it would be incredibly annoying to activate for him since you need to swap to two-handing every time you want to activate it. There just isn't enough that this brings to the table to justify running it, and it's an easy F on everyone but Wylder and Raider, and even for them, I'd say it's still a D tier skill. Alright, Hoarfrost Stomp. If you remember the early days of Elden Ring, you know how busted this skill was, and in Nightreign, it's no different. This skill can absolutely demolish fodder enemies, and for bosses, you can get easy frostbite procs off while dealing respectable damage too. This is an awesome skill for melee-based Nightfarers who don't necessarily find themselves using FP often, so you can just dump all of your FP into stomps, then get back to smashing once you've used it all up. This is probably the best AoE damage starter skill you can run, and the Frostbite helps your whole team on top of the massive damage it's dealing. If you're not trying to run a specific type of damage for a Night Lord by using elemental strike skills, then this is easily the next best option, and I'd call it an S tier starter skill that can massively ramp up your early game clearing while still having utility throughout the run. While you might think Storm Stomp would be good since it shares half a name with Hoarfrost Stomp, this is far from the case. You get a whirlwind effect around you that does significant stagger damage, which is neat, but the damage it provides is absolutely pitiful. Even with it being an AoE skill, this is just way too underwhelming to justify running over any other starting skill or most other relic effects in general. Easy F tier here too. If you're a melee character aside from Revenant, looking to run poison on a build, but want to make the entire weapon itself a poison weapon, this is your next best option as it'll apply a poison grease effect while performing a strong attack that leaves a poison cloud when the skill is used. Unfortunately, you can't apply this to bows, sorry Ironeye. For fighting Adele or running Poison Ant builds, this can be a smart way to further increase your poison buildup, but I'd still call it a B tier in those scenarios. Then as a general effect, I'd say it's a D in all honesty, as it's not going to be upping your DPS by any meaningful amount. But generally, I'd say the other elemental damage amp skills are better here. Another quick one here, Glint Blade Phalanx is okay and does around 130 damage per cast depending on the Nightfarer that can use this as a starter skill, but it's just completely outclassed, and having to cast it for such a small amount of damage will typically make it a net decrease in DPS, though it's almost guaranteed to hit against most enemies, assuming they're not zipping around too much. I wouldn't ever run this though, and would say it's another F tier effect. Alright, so Poison Mothlight is an interesting one in that it does a massive chunk of damage when you hit a poisoned enemy with it. It'll wipe that poison status from them, but it won't reset their build-up counter, so against big bosses, you'll quickly bring them up to max resistance to poison by wiping it a couple times. Now, unless you're also running a poison starter weapon or you pick some other poison weapon up naturally, then you're going to have a much tougher time making use of this skill in fights. The strike itself does apply build-up and it does some solid damage, but it's a bit slow and can leave you open to strong hits. It may also not be desirable to wipe poison off an enemy, but since most poison proc effects don't last as long as the poison effect itself, this can actually work in your favor by giving you time to rebuild a new poison proc before the original buff wears off. This is definitely a playstyle altering skill that I wouldn't call amazing, but in a build that revolves around multiple poison effects or going up against Adele who has a poison weakness, then it would be an A tier skill to consider running. Otherwise I'd call it a D because it's kind of just a bleed effect with extra steps. Prayerful Strike is a neat little skill that can only be used on Raider's starting weapon, and it does double your normal attack damage, deals a massive amount of stagger damage, and heals you and nearby allies. The one issue with this is that the FP cost is pretty high, so you can only get a few off per fight, but the CC and healing it does is definitely solid. That said, using any of the Holy, Lightning, or Flaming Strikes effects also does a solid amount of damage, albeit with less stagger and no heal, but you get a pretty much permanent grease effect to skyrocket your DPS at all times, which makes this pale in comparison. If you aren't fortunate enough to be able to run one of those though, this is a good enough skill that I'd say it's a legitimate B tier for how much it can offer to the team. Eruption is a skill that can only be used on Wylder and Raider out of the gates that does solid stagger damage, a decent chunk of fire damage, and leaves a pool of lava for a few seconds that can deal another few hundred damage if an enemy stays on it for the duration. While it's mildly useful, it has a slow cast time and leaves you very vulnerable, while also not giving any extra lasting damage buffs or massive AoE clearing like the other skills I've mentioned so far. If you have nothing better to run, it'll be alright to use here and there, and maybe when picking up allies to have the lava prevent the revive bar from resetting as quickly in a dicey boss fight, but beyond that, it's nothing special. I call it a C tier effect, and I think that's being generous to be honest. White Shadow's Lure is just Revenant's starting ability that's supposed to help draw aggro to it to keep the heat off of you. It can be useful for fishing for backstabs and generally just giving you a window to breathe, but honestly, it's just so bad in my opinion that I think you're better off running just about anything other than this. Maybe in a solo run it could be ever so slightly helpful, but then you've given up a chance to run all of the massively better starting skills. I think this deserves to be F tier as well. This next one is a broad effect that gives you some random item at the start of an expedition like throwing pots, knives, grease, or starlight shards. I personally think they're pretty awful overall because they're temporary and you can easily find plentiful supplies of any of these items just by running over a couple boxes at any point in the run, but they can make the very first mini boss or camp you kill a little bit easier. For example, the Gravity Stone Shards or Throwing Pots can do a couple hundred damage, which does a pretty solid chunk of damage, but once you've used them, obviously all the benefit from this effect has been exhausted. There's just so many more permanent effects you could run to get greater benefit from, but it can be handy for the very first minute of the game, so I'll be kind and give it a D-. And our very last effect is yet another garbage effect. You get another slot for holding items like consumables right out of the gate, but this is only worth a couple thousand runes. So sure, you can hold an extra throwing pot or a pickled foot, but let's be real. This isn't making any real difference in your run, so it's another easy F tier from me. Holy smokes, we finally made it to the end of this absolute beast of a tier list. I'm going to do my best to throw up a somewhat helpful complete breakdown of all the relic rankings, but I apologize in advance for it not looking pretty because this is a ridiculous amount of effects to draft up a list for. I'm well over 150 hours into this project at this point, and my sanity is heavily degraded. For Nightfarer specific relics, I think additional skill charges for Ironeye and Wylder are excellent all around for map movement, damage, and avoiding damage altogether. Revenant and Guardian's ult-related skills are fantastic for team survivability, while Raider's skill that buffs him while taking damage during his skill is absolutely godly for upping his DPS. Similarly, almost all of Recluse's Nightfarer specific effects are very powerful, with the Bone-like Stone being a great pick to run in almost any scenario for her. Wylder's Earring and Revenant's Old Portrait are similarly strong in general, along with Duchess's Golden Dew, even though it's only a medium relic. For boss relics, the Knight of the Beast is one of the best relics to run for Fire Weak bosses. The Dark Knight of the Wise is one of the single best relics any mage can run, while the Knight of the Fathom is probably the best team-oriented relic in the game, though it requires heavy comms and organization to actually get the max value out of it. The Cracked Ceiling Wax and the Knight of the Demon relics are just absolute horseshit and are straight up filler in contrast. The Dark Knight of the Champion is another very strong relic for anybody using affinity attacks, while the Knight of the Lord is similarly strong but requires you to actively weapon swap, so it can be annoying, but the payoff for doing so is worth it. Generally though, a lot of these named relics are quite bad, with only 1 or 2 effects even on large relics being useful, while most of the mediums don't even have 1 good effect. In most cases, you're actually going to be better off running an unnamed large relic that has 3 reasonably strong effects, even if none of them are specific to your Nightfarer but are just good for the run generally. To that point, large damage boosters, especially like the ones you get from changing your starting armament skill like Sacred Blade and the other elemental equivalents, Seppuku and Hoarfrost Stomp, are all leagues above everything else and provide massive damage boosts or AoE abilities. Nothing is currently going to compete with the Evergaol effect in terms of just raw DPS boosting, and on the mage's side, the max FP booster for unlocking rises. The Night Invader one has the potential to be on that level, but it's too random to be consistent and averages out just being okay. Some other boosters to damage output, like the stamina recovered on successful attacks, are very good, along with the starting armament changes to a particular affinity, as this can up your damage by 50% in most cases against Night Lords weak to that damage type. Some of our strongest utility effects include the Arc Gauge Charge on Kills effect that makes Knights 1 and 2 ulting incredibly frequent. We also have the big buffs to FP, HP, and Stamina that heavily outclass their more basic counterparts with the +1 to 3 variants. FP Restoration on successive attacks and the standard FP Restoration for each attack gives Duchess and Revenant more reliable ways to pull off a spellcaster build with reliable FP generation as well. Some other neat effects like the guard counter boosters really help amplify Guardian's core fighting style, while the rally mechanic effect lets you eat hits and play more aggressively with any Nightfarer. Then we have the hold 3 or more weapons, staves, or shields effects that are significantly stronger than most people probably thought, though they can be tough to upkeep and require comms, solo play, or a trio of the same Nightfarer to reliably use. There are many other effects that provide solid and situational benefits that can help make your runs more successful, but these are definitely some of the most notable off the top of my head. If you made it this far, I hope you've learned a lot about the inner workings of the game and that you have a much better idea of what relics are best for you to run with your favorite Nightfarers for any given situation. If you found this video helpful and are interested in more ridiculously detailed tier lists and analysis type content, then consider subscribing and helping me hit my goal of 100k subs before the end of the year. If you disagree with any of my rankings or have other insights to share about some of the relic effects or mechanics in the game, then I'd love to hear from you in the comments. The discussion on my tier list videos are always my favorite and I learn so much from all of you. That's all I've got for you today. In case you haven't seen my video on how to be a better teammate in Nightreign, you can check that video out next. Don't worry, it's not 2 hours long. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.